Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is another 2 chapters of Inventing Reality, The Politics of the News Media by Michael Parenti. So the Google Drive link will be in the description section. Please download the book. Please, buy the book on Amazon. It's always good to keep these books in print. The U.S. government tries to censor them. They become less popular because the U.S. government promotes their own, versions of history. They rewrite the history and they rewrite the media response. And then they, publish that in the name of white supremacy and fascism. They're Ku Klux Klan Nazi government. So let's get started. Yesterday, we reviewed 2 things that came to mind was their, torture. Their torture centers in Chile. We talked about their torture centers under Augusto Pinochet. It's the same thing throughout their client states. All of their fascist client states conducted, murderous torture, just suffering and agony to the people of the indigenous places. But, talking about Chile, we wanted to bring up the fact that, the Indians of Chile, they were the ones who were subjected to the worst treatment by the Ku Klux Klan Nazi government, white scoundrels of the U.S. government. That is who give the maximum torture. They stuck vaginas they stuck rats, infected rats, in their vagina. They stuck machetes in their anus and vagina. This is what Washington is up to. No matter how much you hate people, you got to follow international rules. You Ku Klux Klan Nazi government. You can't just do this to people because you don't like their blood or skin. This is disgusting. It's despicable behavior on the part of the racist white scoundrels of Washington. And so that was one thing we discussed. The other thing we discussed is that they subvert elections. Their media are liars. Their government is liars. They do enforced disappearances. We discussed it. It is the enforced disappearance capital of the world. That is the gravest human rights crime against citizens of a country. It is the gravest crime against the human being to, abduct them and murder them in captivity without documenting it. That is what the government of the United States supported through its 30 years of fascist dictatorship in all its lands. It supported kidnapping, murder, and then mutilation so that you can't even find out who the body is that you murdered. They are Ku Klux Klan Nazi government of the United States. That is what we respond to when we hear about all of these things of enforced disappearance. More than, hundreds and thousands of peoples were enforced disappeared by the regimes of the fascist client states. The worst in the world was the U.S. government. Then they talk about, nice, actions. They talk about being champion, third world people. They are racist, anti-ethnic, third world murderers. They're Ku Klux Klan Nazis, not, normal people. They're white supremacists, fascist mafia thugs, is what I would say regarding that. So we're going to talk about the U.S. mass media, fascist illiterate press. The problems of the press we talked about were suppression, non-diversity of reporting, poor balance, outright lies and fabrication, falsifications, large omissions, non-balanced coverage, producing a propaganda system as a team with the U.S. government conspiring against the third world. We talked about the newspapers, the Reuters newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, Newsweek, Reader's Digest, Time Magazine, Associated Press, UPI, Reuters, and Press Agencie France, mafia, quote unquote, gang of 4. It's a mafia, gang of 4 in journalism. So, in summary, the sick white racist scoundrels of the United States help their government, sick white racist scoundrels of the U.S. mass media help their government in imperialism, racism, hate violence, murder cover-ups, kidnapping cover-ups, torture cover-ups, rape cover-ups, racist theft, and racist oppression. So let's do the quiz. Time rewrote from the news from Vietnam because of weekly phone calls from President Lyndon Johnson and urged the reporters to be called liars. That's true. Time rewrote the news from Vietnam because of weekly phone calls from President Lyndon Johnson and urged the reporters to be called liars. The U.S. government aided torture in Chile, including placing infected rats into the vagina of women, shoving bayonets and clubs in the vagina and anus, and placing acid on male testicles. That's true. The U.S. government aided torture in Chile, including placing infected rats into the vagina of women, shoving bayonets and clubs in the vagina and anus, and placing acid on the male testicles. Newsweek fabricated stories on Grenada as defenders of being Cuban and extremely well armed. That's true. The Newsweek fabricated stories on Grenada as the, quote, defenders being Cuban and extremely well armed. The Nicaraguan election of 1984 was deemed fair by foreign observers, but yet the New York Times disputed the Sandinista victory and called the election fraud. That's true. The Nicaraguan election of 1984 was deemed fair by foreign observers, but yet the New York Times disputed the Sandinista victory and called the election fraud. And finally, the major media did not report the casualties of the Iraq War and stated no Iraqi dead, despite London Times assessing as many as 200,000 Iraqis were killed. That's true. The major media did not report casualties in the Iraq War and stated no Iraqi dead, despite the London Times assessing as many as 200,000 killed. So let's get started. We're starting on page 197, propaganda themes. Most news biases are so consistent and political in nature as to suggest that they are the outcomes of influence larger than the imperfect efforts of individual reporters. Regardless of who is involved in manufacturing the news, one can detect persistent themes in how the mainstream press presents our country's role in the world to us. American virtue and American anti-Americanism. The press sometimes will criticize U.S. foreign policy is ill-defined or overextended, but never lacking in virtuous intent. To maintain this image, the news media say little about the U.S. role in financing, equipping, training, advising, and directing the repressive military apparatus that exists in U.S. client states around the world, little about the mass killings of entire villages, the paramilitary death squads, the torture and disappearances. The brutality does not go entirely unnoticed, but press reports are usually sporadic and sparse, rarely doing justice to the endemic nature of the repression, rarely, if ever, showing how the repression functions to protect the few rich from the many poor and how it is linked to U.S. policy. Thus, when Time magazine developed a full-page story to torture throughout the world, the U.S. came out looking like Snow White. Following the official line, the national media will readily deny that the United States harbors aggressive intentions against other governments and will dismiss such charges by them as just so much, quote, anti-American propaganda and as evidence of their aggressive intent towards us. Our media will condone the aggressive actions as necessary for our national security or implicitly accept them as a given reality, needing no justification. For instance, in 1961, Cuban right-wing emigres trained and financed by the CIA invaded Cuba, in the words of one of their leaders, to overthrow Castro and set up a provisional government, quote, that, quote, will restore all the properties to the rightful owners. Reports of impending invasion circulated widely throughout Central America, but in the United States, stories were suppressed by the Associated Press and United Press International, and by all major networks, newspapers, and news weeklies. In an impressively unanimous act of self-censorship, some 75 American publications rejected reports offered by the editors of The Nation in 1960, detailing U.S. preparations for the invasion. Fidel Castro's accusation that the United States was planning to invade Cuba was dismissed by the New York Times as shrill anti-American propaganda, and by Time as Castro's continued tawdry little melodrama of invasion. When Washington broke diplomatic relations with Cuba in 1961 January, after Castro started nationalizing U.S. corporate investments and instituting social programs for the poor, the Times explained what snapped U.S. patience was a new propaganda offensive from Havana, charging that the U.S. was plotting an imminent invasion of Cuba. Yet after the day of Big's invasion proved to be something more than a figment of Castro's anti-Americanism, there was almost a lack of media criticism regarding the moral and legal impropriety. Instead, editorial commentary referred to disappointing fiasco and disastrous attempt. Revelations about the full extent of U.S. involvement, including the CIA training camp in Guatemala, began to appear in the post-invasion period in the same press that earlier had denied such things existed. These retrospective admissions of U.S. involvement were discussed unapologetically and treated as background for further moves against Cuba. Perspectives did not implicitly assume that U.S. policy was well-intentioned and supportive of democratic interests were excluded from media commentary. The media dismiss conflicts that arise between the United States and popular forces in other countries as manifestations of the latter's quote-unquote anti-Americanism. During the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis, when ABC asked an expert whether being a Shiite Muslim meant being anti-American, he replied that it did. Over footage of Muslim crowds chanting, "God is great," ABC commentator Frank Reynolds voiced what he's supposed to be their real meaning, hatred of America. Similarly, CBS Walter Cronkite spoke of Muslim hatred of this country. When thousands marched in the Philippines against the abominated U.S. Marcos-supported regime, the New York Times reported anti-Marcos and anti-American slogans and banners were in abundance, with the most common being "down with the U.S. Marcos dictatorship." A few weeks later, the Time again described the Filipino protesters against U.S. support of the Marcos dictatorship as, quote, anti-Americanism. After noting that the Ethiopian Revolution of 1974 grew out of a general despair for prevailing conditions without much ideology behind it, the Washington Post concluded that the revolution had a quote-unquote anti-American thrust. More accurately, the revolution might have been called anti-feudal and anti-imperialist. Protests in Mexico, Argentina, Cuba, Nicaragua, and other Latin American nations against CIA counterinsurgency have all been reduced by the American Express to expressions of quote-unquote anti-Americanism. The same description was applied to the protests in England, Germany, and other Western nations against the placement of U.S. cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe during the 1980s. So Ku Klux Klan, Nazi, anti-Americanism. The mainstream media began with unexamined premise that the U.S. foreign policy is above reproach except in operational criticism as to efficiency. Therefore, if massive demonstrators and rioters in other countries denounce that policy as imperialistic and oppressive, it can only be because they suffer from anti-Americanism, quote. That is, they have an implacable hatred of American Americans. Anti-Americanism is treated as an irrational hostility toward the American people, rather than a possibly just justified hostility toward the imposing of oppressive nature of U.S. policies. By that view, West Germans did not dislike us for putting nuclear missiles on their soil. Rather, they opposed the missiles because they disliked us. The press ascribes the opposition directed against U.S. policies to some kind of nationalistic prejudice within the protesters and ignores the substance of the protest. The non-existence of imperialism. While Washington policymakers argue that U.S. overseas intervention is necessary to protect our interests, the press seldom asks what our interests are and who among us is actually served by them. As we have seen in regard to Nicaragua, Grenada, Panama, Iraq, and other cases, defending U.S. interests usually means imposing a client state status on nations that might strike a course of independence of and even inimical to global corporate investment. This is rarely the reason given in the national media. Rather, it is almost always a matter of stopping aggression or protecting our national security, as punishing leaders who are said to be dictators, drug dealers, or state terrorists. References may occasionally appear in the press about the great disparities of wealth and poverty in third world nations, but U.S. corporate imperialism is never treated as one of the causes of such poverty. Indeed, it seems the U.S. press has never heard of U.S. imperialism. Imperialism, the process by which the dominant interests of one country expropriate the land, labor, markets, capital, natural resources of the other. And neo-imperialism, the process of expropriation that occurs without direct colonization, are both unmentionable. Anyone who might try to introduce the subject would quickly be dismissed as ideological. Media, people like mainstream academics and others might recognize that the U.S. went through a brief imperialist period around the Spanish-American War, and they would probably acknowledge that there once existed ancient Roman imperialism and 19th century British imperialism, and certainly 20th century Soviet imperialism. But not many, if any, mainstream editors and commentators would consider the existence of U.S. imperialism or neo-imperialism, let alone entertain criticisms of it. Media commentators, like political leaders, treat corporate investment as a solution to third world poverty and indebtedness rather than the cause. What U.S. corporations do in the third world is a story largely untold. In tiny El Salvador alone, U.S. Steel, Alcoa, Westinghouse, United Brands, Standard Fruit, Del Monte Cargo, Procter & Gamble, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America, First National Bank, Texaco, and at least 25 major companies reap big profits by paying Salvadoran workers subsistence wages to produce everything from aluminum products and baking powder, transformers, computers, and steel pipes, almost all for export markets, and all done without minimum wage laws, occupational safety, environmental controls, and other hindrances to capital accumulation. The profit reaped from the exploitation of cheap and oppressed labor market in an impoverished country like El Salvador are much higher than what would be procured by stateside industries. Of the hundreds of reports about El Salvador in the major broadcast and print media in recent years, few, if any, treat the basic facts about U.S. economic imperialism. Nor does the press say much about El Salvador's internal class structure, in which a small number of immediate families, rich families, own all the best farmland and receive 50% of the nation's income. Nor is much said about the U.S. military aid used to maintain this privileged class system. What capitalism is as a transnational system does to impoverish people throughout the world is simply not a fit subject in the U.S. news media. Instead, poverty is treated as its own cause. We are asked to believe the third world people are poor because that has long been their condition. They live in countries that are overpopulated, or there is something about their land, culture, or temperament that makes them unable to cope. Subsistence wages, forced displacement from homesteads, the plunder of natural resources, the lack of public education and public health programs, the suppression of independent labor unions, and other democratic forces by U.S.-supported police states. Such things, if we were to believe that they remain untreated in the media, have nothing to do with the poverty in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Moderate authoritarian regimes. Nations like Guatemala, El Salvador, South Korea, South Africa, Indonesia, Chile, Turkey, Pakistan, Zaire, and Honduras are not just police-dominated states. They are client states of the United States. That is, their economies serve the needs of the Western, especially American capitalism, providing natural resources, cheap labor, and profitable investment in exchange for millions of dollars in aid that go to the client states' wealthy ruling elites and military chieftains, often one and the same. As already noted, the everyday acts of repression, torture, and assassination perpetrated by these regimes, with the aid and assistance of U.S. counterinsurgency agencies, are usually ignored by the major media. The role and savagery of political repression is less a factor in commanding the media's attention than the politics of victim and victimizer. If the left is suppressing the right, as with the treatment of dissidents in communist countries, then the American public is treated to protracted press coverage. But if the repression is by the right against the left, even in much greater scope and ferocity, the news is suppressed or downplayed, and even none of the detailed repetition and strong editorial commentary need to create a climate of opinion on the issue. Thus, the arrest of anti-government leaders and the death of several protesters in what was communist Poland in 1981 received saturation coverage for several weeks, as did the suppression of the Tiananmen Square student protesters in communist China in 1989. But the massive political repressions in Turkey in 1980 to 81, involving the incarceration of over 100,000 persons and the torture and execution of about 5,000, and the 1965 massacre in Indonesia, resulting in the slaughter of about 500,000 in some estimates, or as high as 1 million in other estimates, received but slight attention or went entirely unreported in the mainstream media, even though the last two incidents were of a magnitude many times greater than anything that happened in Poland and China. Along with downplaying repression and atrocities, the press describes U.S. client states as friendly to U.S. interests, and again with no precise explanation as to what that might mean. The press also regularly describes client state leaders as purveyors of order and stability. Popular agitation is assumed to be an undesirable thing, while the absence of such agitation, even if achieved with police repression and murder, is taken as beneficial. Terms like the country's strongman, tough, severe, firm, no nonsense, and clampdown give a non-criminal disciplinary framing to the coups and massacres perpetrated by the Chilean, Indonesian, Argentinian, Uruguayan, Turkish, Bolivian, Greek, and Brazilian militaries, all of whom were supposedly obliged to take firm action against the prevailing chaos. Thus, the Washington Post could describe the bloody repression in Turkey as a military clampdown that rescued the country from the brink of civil war. And the New York Times noted how Pinochet, quote unquote, took power in Chile amid social chaos. Often the military clampdown is portrayed as an even-handed one, equally repressive of left and right extremists. Thus, press stories about Guatemala long propagated the fiction of a besieged centrist government trying to end a terrorist war that has been raging for years between leftist and rightist groups. But reports by Amnesty International indicated that the large-scale extrajudicial executions of non-combatant civilians, numbering many thousands in Guatemala, has been perpetrated by government troops and paramilitary death squads. By portraying the military autocrats as striking a course between the violent extremes of left and right, the press is able to, on one stroke, exonerate them from any complicity in the government-sponsored mass terror and transform them into the middle-of-the-road peaceable leadership that is potentially, if not actually, democratic. Thus, NBC News in 1980 described the government of El Salvador, which had been terrorizing and murdering peasants and workers for several decades, as quote-unquote moderate. The Christian Science Monitor exonerated the Salvadoran military government of any guilt. The county's buffeted junta, weathering almost daily disorders and vicious verbal attacks from both the left and right, faces its most serious tempest to date. The image is touching, the buffeted generals steering the ship of state through disorderly waters, enduring vicious verbal attacks from left and right, with nothing to keep them through their travails except their troops, death squads, artillery, jet bombers, helicopter gunships, and CIA, Pentagon, and U.S. State Departments. The New York Times repeated the State Department line that this moderate, quote-unquote, Salvadoran government was implementing the most sweeping land reform, the fastest ever carried out in Latin America, so fast as to soon become indiscernible. Other junta activities received less media fanfare. By 1950, some 175,000 people, mostly non-combatants, had been killed by the military. Over 1 million refugees, 1 out of every 4 Salvadorans, had abandoned their home regions or fled the country entirely, the military's moderation having been proven too much for them. South Africa is another repressive regime that has been morally motivated by U.S. corporate news media. By 1990, the government of F.W. de Klerk was being portrayed as charting a courageous middle course between the right-wing white supremacists and the Xhosa communists of the African National Congress. Thousands of people were killed in what the U.S. press repeatedly called bloody tribal battles, ethnic fighting, and black-on-black violence between the opposing clans, quote-unquote, of the ANC Xhosa and the Ikatha Zulu 25. The U.S. media never labeled the bloodletting taking places like Northern Ireland or Yugoslavia as white-on-white violence, quote-unquote. Government troops and police are described as trying to stop blacks chanting war cries from slashing and stabbing each other. Such reports elicit the racist image of African tribal warriors who are too primitive and violent to rule themselves. To the Ku Klux Klan American press. Ikatha is an atavistic counter-revolutionary South African organization set up in 1975 by Mangosuthu Buthelezi. The New York Times enthusiastically described Buthelezi as a man of real bearings and a leader with whom both President F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela must reckon. Buthelezi has been portrayed in the U.S. media as an independent and popular nationalist leader who, while against apartheid, supports a moderate democratic course, differing from the revolutionary one taken by Mandela's ANC. In fact, far from opposing apartheid, Buthelezi is himself a product and beneficiary of that system, having been appointed head of the KwaZulu Bantustan, one of a number of racially segregated puppet regime, quote-unquote, homelands set up by the apartheid regime. Democracy does not exist in KwaZulu. Chief Buthelezi tolerates no opposition in parties and no dissent. While posing as a black nationalist, he has secretly collaborated with the apartheid regime and the military, receiving large sums of money to carry out his attacks against blacks of the ANC. His Inkatha forces have been secretly trained by the South African Defense Forces and linked to terrorist groups like Renamo in Mozambique. The U.S. media have done less to probe the links between the government and Inkatha that the censored South African press. The U.S. media have done less to probe the links between the government and Inkatha than the censored South African press. Far from being nonviolent and moderate, Buthelezi has waged a war of terror and murder against ANC African National Congress supporters, most of whom are unarmed. Buthelezi has been designated as a, quote, Zulu leader by U.S. media, but surveys reveal that relatively few Zulus outside his Inkatha organization support him, the majority identifying themselves as feeling closest to Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. Relying solely on the U.S. mainstream media, we would not likely be privy to his debunking information about yet another moderate leader who carries the banner of democracy on his lethal weapons. Evil power and hungry leftists. The accomplishment of revolutionary populist governments in advancing the well-being of their peoples remain one of the more thoroughly suppressed stories in the U.S. press. You never read anything about the good that Allende was doing, admitted one former attaché to the U.S. Embassy in Chile. Earlier, we noted how the press squelched news about the economic substances of the Allende government, the new jewel in Grenada, and the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, and depicted them as oppressive regimes. The U.S. press characterizes nations going through transformation that limits the prerogatives of private capital as taking a totalitarian road, quote unquote. Once designated as leftists, they are assumed to be up to no good and are accused of destroying individual freedom and democracy in countries where no freedom and democracy had existed under the previous right-wing regimes. After almost a century of propaganda, designations like Marxist, communist leftists, or leftist guerrillas create their own automatic negative framing. Thus, in regard to the invasion of Grenada in 1983, a New York Times editorial decided that the fear was real, that Grenada could infect the Caribbean with militant leftism. But the Times offered not a word about the actual program content of Grenadian militant leftism. In such instances, the media do not publicize the capitalist ideology as such. They just assume it. In actuality, the distinguishing characteristic of Marxist, quote unquote, and leftist, quote unquote, as opposed to rightist, is a commitment to the kind of social and economic change that benefits the less favored mass of peasants and workers at the expense of the wealthy classes of the third world and Western financial interests. The revolutionary Marxist left is committed to using a country's resources and labor for the purposes of eliminating poverty and illiteracy, serving the needs of the populace rather than the profit needs of the rich investors. From the U.S. news media, one learns that, quote, leftists and communists are not persons motivated by longings for justice, equality, and a decent life, but conspirators who take advantage of such longings. Discussing the struggles in Guatemala and El Salvador, Washington Post and former CIA agent Philip Galen referred to communist exploitation of grievances and the communist contribution to instability. We learned that leftists try to gain strength, create chaos, take advantage of turmoil, destabilize, and grab power, subjecting whole countries in the doing. What moves them to such perilous undertakings? As the press would have it, Marxists and other leftist revolutionaries will risk and sacrifice their lives because of nothing more than a nihilistic pursuit of power. Supposedly, they do not seek power to end misery and hunger. They simply hunger miserably for power. If they initiate land reform, public health programs, and literacy programs, it is only to win popular support and further secure their power base. The media usually do not explain why right-wing leaders are above using popular programs to secure their power base. Such reforms would defeat the very purpose of their existence, which is to live well off the impoverished labor of others. So they rely instead on death squads, police terror, and slash and burn insurgency. The leftists are so wanting in virtue that even their seemingly good acts can be dismissed as venally motivated. The press does not explain why, if revolutionaries are driven only by hunger from power, they identify themselves with the oppressed and powerless, rather than with the powerful oppressors. What do talented and highly intelligent leftist leaders take such dangerous and painfully circuitous roads to power, and that when they might be more advantageously apply their energies to winning the rewards of a high position and influence, to serving the existing system in the manner of countless political climates in both rich and poor countries? The media treat leftist revolutionary struggles in El Salvador, Angola, Guatemala, and other countries as dangerous conspiracies, not as the outgrowth of popular grievances and mass struggles. Revolutions are seen as being, by their very nature, disruptive, destabilizing, violent, and undemocratic, even when directed against oppressive tyrants, especially the moderate authoritarian tyrants who preside over U.S. client states. However, revolution becomes a good thing, enthusiastically celebrated in the media when it takes a rightward course, as when directed against communist governments in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So a Washington Post TV critic could gush after viewing this PBS series 1991, Soviets. Every revolution is a mystical human upheaval. All communists or other left revolutionary governments, be it Cuba, Vietnam, Libya, or Nicaragua, have made friendly overtures to the United States. But even when reporting such positive gestures, the U.S. press perpetuates the stereotype of communists as sinister aggressors. In 1984, the New York Times ran a news analysis headlined, "What's Behind Castro's Softer Tone?" The headline itself suggested that Castro was up to something. The opening sentence read, "Once again, Fidel Castro is talking as if he wants to improve relations with the United States, as if, not actually, Castro," explained the Times, "was interested in taking advantage of American trade, technology, and tourism, and would prefer not to be spending so much time and energy on national defense." Here seemed to be a promising basis for improved relations. Cuba's own self-interest, Castro was saying, rested on closer economic ties with Washington and cuts in Cuban defense spending, and not, as the United States was saying, on military buildups and aggressive confrontation. Nevertheless, the Time analysis made nothing of Castro's stated desire to ease tension and instead presented the rest of the story from the U.S. government perspective. It is noted that most Reagan administration officials seem skeptical. The administration continues to believe that the best way to deal with the Cuban leader is with unyielding firmness. Administration officials see little advantage in wavering. The article did not explain what justified the skeptical scans, nor why a negative response to Castro should be described as unyielding firmness, rather than, say, unyielding rigidity. Nor did it say why a willingness to respond to his overture must be labeled as wavering. The Times left the impression that power-hungry Castro was out to get something from us, but our leaders weren't about to be taken in. There was no mention in the article of what United States had to lose if it entered friendlier relations with Cuba. Another leftist defamed by U.S. propaganda was Father Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a populist priest who sided with the poor against the rich and who blamed the United States government and its corporate system for much of Haiti's economic woes. In December 1990, shortly before Aristides won an overwhelming 70% of the vote to become Haiti's first freely elected president, the New York Times ran an article headline, "Front-Running Priest, a Shock to Haiti." The story admitted that Aristides was popular among Haiti's poor, who composed the vast majority of the country. Who then in Haiti was shocked by Aristides' candidacy? The business community, the army, the church, and the landowners, the kind of people whom the Times accords respectful attention. The story quotes a downtrodden businessman who alarmingly describes Aristide as a cross between Ayatollah and Fidel. During the 9 months of Aristides' tenure, the U.S. Embassy gave every appearance of maintaining friendly relations with him. On September 30th, 1991, the Haitian military, with the support of rich landowners and the business community, overthrew the president, killing 2 of his bodyguards and hundreds of his supporters. Aristides fled into exile. The United States refused to recognize the junta. Still, it is hard to imagine that the Haitian military, trained and aided by the Pentagon, would have taken such a drastic action if it had not received a quiet nod from Washington. At first, the U.S. media called for the restoration of Aristides' presidency. One New York Times reporter, displaying his delusions about U.S. foreign policy, wrote that the only reason the United States pushed aggressively to restore President Aristides was that his democracy was the last link in a chain of democratic governments Washington has been trying to nurture next door for the last 20 years. President Bush, who earlier that year had used massive military violence to restore a feudal aristocracy in Kuwait, now made it clear he would not consider using force to reinstate a democratically elected president in Haiti. Bush was even reluctant to impose sanctions on Haiti, supposedly out of fear of hurting the Nicaraguan people, a consideration that did not deter him in regard to Nicaragua, Cuba, Vietnam, or Iraq. Once they realized that Washington was not really unhappy about the overthrow of the leftist priest, who was more loyal to the poor than the class that Bush and their own media bosses represented, mainstream journalists began to give Aristides the usual mistreatment. A New York Times story referred to the provocative and legally questionable behavior. At times, news analysts found him to be an insular and menacing leader who alienated his allies. The Washington Post reported that independent observers and diplomats were troubled because Aristides had used explicit and implicit threats of mob violence to intimidate opponents in the wealthy business class, in the National Assembly, and in the army. For years, the Post story continued, there had been concern about Aristides' rhetoric and his using the threat of violence to enforce his will and fomenting class warfare in his sermons. The media referred to class warfare only when the poor fight back against the class warfare that is continually waged against them by the rich. The Post had other criticisms of Aristides. When a despised leader of the Tukuns Mukutis, a terrorist de Villiers organization, was thwarted the January attempt to keep the newly elected president from office, Aristides was only mildly critical of the mob violence that crushed the attempt. In other words, when the people mobilized as a counterforce to protect the democratic president from an unlawful and violent coup, they should be more thoroughly condemned by that same president. They too committed violent acts in the course of the struggle. The Post, meanwhile, said nothing about the failure of the Haitian business community to condemn the military violence that overthrew Aristides and killed hundreds of his followers. A New York Times article had headlined, High Hand General says misdeeds prompted the coup, gave generous exposure to the coup general leader, Brigadier General Raul Cedros, a member of the counterinsurgency unit set up under the former de Villiers dictatorship and trained by U.S. Special Forces. Cedros claimed that Aristides' human rights abuses were what prompted the coup. It is ironic to hear such a charge from the general, who repeatedly committed brutal violations against Duvalier and had overthrown a popularly elected president, executing many of his democratic supporters. The press seemed to forget that it was the military, not the impoverished people of Haiti, who had the guns and who were doing the killing. The U.S. media gave more critical attention to Aristides' rhetorical denunciations of the military's atrocities than to the atrocities themselves. The media gave almost no attention to Aristides' call for a minimum wage land reform and enforced tax collection on the affluent, the real reasons for his overthrow. Aristides denied ever inciting his people to violence, although he certainly did urge them to unify and defend democracy against violence. Surveys of non-Haitian groups indicate that human rights violations had fallen sharply during Aristides' tenure in office. Even the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, a branch of the OAS, admitted that it had not received one human rights complaint since Aristides came to power. Violating in 1991, Prime Minister of Haiti, picked by the army, was Jean-Jacques Honorat, a conservative and the recipient of funds from the Ford Foundation and the National Endowment for Democracy, a U.S. government-funded organization that supports leaders who do what Washington wants. The message was the same as in so many other countries. If democracy picks a leftist leader, then democracy has to go. Economic failures, quote unquote. Countries that take revolutionary, even reformist road are regularly accused of economic mismanagement. The press views any attempt to get out from under the domination of U.S. policies as a first step toward economic disaster. What might be harmful to powerful corporate interests is treated as harmful to all of society itself. Likewise, any challenge to the privileged class order is portrayed as an attack on all social order and an invitation to chaos. Thus, in 1964, when Brazil's reformist president, João Goulart, was overthrown in a military coup, the New York Times quickly editorialized that Goulart had been turning Brazil over to chaos. In 1975, when leftist officers in the Portuguese military overthrew the hated Salazar dictatorship and began initiating social programs for the poor and cuts in military spending, the New York Times concluded that such measures threatened to dismantle the economy and cause an even deeper economic crisis. The Times offered not a word of evidence to support this conclusion, nor any specific information about the reforms. So the Ku Klux Klan Nazi government of the United States, in their dealings in Haiti and Cuba and Brazil. After the New Deal movement in Grenada overthrew the Gary dictatorship and began making economic changes on behalf of the people, the United States suspended aid and credits and discouraged tourism on the island. Yet Grenada's gross national product grew by 5.5%, and its inflation rate dropped to 7%. But soon after the U.S. invasion, the Washington Post, without any supporting information, transmitted the White House view that the economy of Grenada was left bankrupt by its former Marxist rulers. To better create the impression of economic failure and widespread disaffection, the news manufacturers concentrate on the discontent of the middle-class persons without mentioning in the third world countries, the middle class is usually a small and markedly privileged group. These landowners, lawyers, business people, company managers, and conservative political leaders can often lose some of their wealth and privileges under a leftist government. So they are ready to complain about their hardships to a receptive U.S. press. To give only one example among many, the New York Times, in a story headline, "In Libya, wary middle-class endures," described a well-educated woman, smartly dressed, who expressed her disenchantment that the Libyan government's increasingly restrictive travel policies. It seems she replenished her wardrobe each year on a shopping trip to Italy, but this time was allowed only take $300 instead of a $1,000, and if that weren't bad enough, she would have to wait at least 2 months for an exit visa. One could only admire the courageous steadfastness in the face of such hardships. The deprivations and oppressions faced by third world masses usually fail to catch the attention of the U.S. media. I cannot say I interviewed many peasants, and nobody else did either, admitted one reporter, referring to the experience in Chile. But he could have been talking about any other third world country. When a left government takes office, what wins sympathetic attention to the press is not the distribution of bread and powdered milk, the development of clean drinking water, the literacy campaigns, or the creation of jobs in government-sponsored projects in the impoverished countrysides. Rather, it is the empty shops and posh neighborhoods which are treated as evidence of the revolutionary government's economic failure. In sum, there are several rules that govern media coverage. Do not say anything positive about the democratic economic reforms of a leftist government. Show sympathy for haves and ignore the have-nots, unless you find a have-not which does not like the government. Say nothing about the devastating effects of U.S. policy, the proxy wars, invasion, embargoes, and sanctions on the economy of the country in question. Assume the economic adversity is due exclusively to the mismanagement perpetrated by those who would have the audacity to chart a self-determining course. Democracy in the eyes of the beholder. As we have seen, elections in revolutionary countries like Nicaragua are dismissed as a sham until the Revolutionary Party is voted out. When the client state holds an election, no matter how rigged it is, U.S. officials and the press see democracy blooming. In El Salvador in 1981, the military had driven out all opposition parties and leftist newspapers out of existence, murdered hundreds of labor leaders and thousands of political opponents. Whole villages suspected of supporting the guerrilla insurgents were massacred by the army and bombed out of existence by the Air Force. The military regime support came principally from large investors, big landowners, crypto-fascist organizations, and the U.S. government. It was against this backdrop that the 1984 El Salvadoran presidential election was conducted, guided and financially assisted by the U.S. government. The contest pitted Jose Napoleon Duarte, a right-wing Christian Democrat and longtime apologist for state terrorism, against Robert Duopison, head of the Arena Party and longtime practitioner of death squad terrorism. The U.S. press was filled with stories of polling places crowded with people eager to cast their ballots, but never was mentioned that the voting was obligatory and that the failure to vote, as detected by the absence of a stamp in one's identification card, could lead to arrest. The press also did not mention that the ballots were numbered and the numbers recorded on the registration list next to voters' names so officials could find out how many persons voted. Rather than dismissing the election as a meaningless charade, the New York Times called it a step towards democracy. The absence of major opposition dismissed by the Times as a boycott of left-wing parties. ABC reported that the left was invited by the government to participate, but refused. ABC failed to mention that the invitation contained a suicidal precondition. The guerrillas were to lay down their arms and campaign under the guns of a very state that had been systematically killing large numbers of the people. In sum, the background of terror and death squad assassination that made the free elections impossible in El Salvador were ignored by the press, which instead treated it as a contest between two right-wing candidates as a proof of democracy. In 1981, the left opposition dared to enter candidates in the legislative and municipal elections in El Salvador. Despite an atmosphere of intimidation and terror, the left parties won 20% of the vote and took third place behind the two right-wing parties, including the sinister Arena Party. The U.S. media again hailed the election as a major achievement for democracy. True as the article in the San Francisco Chronicle admitted, a bombing shut down a leading opposition newspaper. At least 3 supporters of the Marxist Nationalist Democratic Union were murdered. The leftist candidates received threats on their lives. Still looking at the brighter side, the Chronicle concluded that election day was quote unquote relatively calm. The election itself was relatively clean and the voter fraud was small scale. But the alternative press report that the election was marked by repression, intimidation, vote buying, threats against opposition observers, and manipulation of the count. Such happenings escaped the attention of most of the mainstream media. Quote, inferior peoples and their hopeless ways. For centuries, imperialists have justified their mistreatment of other peoples by portraying them as wanting ethical, cultural, and political development. If there be turmoil in some part of the third world, then the trouble supposedly rests with the people themselves and not with anything that intruders are doing to them. When the U.S. supported coup overthrew Allende and led to a bloody repression of the Pinochet regime, quote, blaming the people became the media's favorite explanation. The CBS commentator Eric Severald opined that the Chilean people brought it on themselves. Another Latin American example of an instability so chronic that the root causes have to lie in the nature and culture of the people. But by way of explaining why Chileans would support Allende and the Popular Unity government, Bernard Collier wrote in the New York Times magazine, the Chileans do not believe in facts, numbers, or statistics with earnest faith of an English-speaking people. While talking to a correspondent who had just reported on the rebellion and famine of Tigray, and NBC anchor Tom Brokaw could only think of asking, you're in London now, which is one of the most sophisticated and civilized cities in the world. Do you have much culture shock after being in that part of Africa? During the Cold War years, the Russians were a prime target of stereotypic pronouncements, describing as unsmiling, rude, and unable to look you in the eye. A former Washington Post correspondent appearing on ABC's 2020 declared that the Russians have a great urge for order. It is part of their personality. To which host Barbara Walters responded that the Russian people lacked, quote, a sense of responsibility because they are told what to do, when to do it. In 1991, at a time of dramatic transition within the Soviet Union, the New York Times noted that the post-communist reformers faced, quote, the mammoth task of civilizing their country. Negative and stereotypic representations of the Arabs are in superabundance. A CBS correspondent ended his report on the Middle East by saying, but of course, sound argument is not always dictated Arab behavior. A New York Times columnist Flora Lewis saw that the Islamic mind, unable to employ step-by-step thinking, had such an assertion been applied to the quote-unquote Christian mind or the quote Hebrew mind, the Times would have likely rejected the nonsensical and bigoted statements. The 1990 to 91 war waged by the United States against Iraq brought a plethora of anti-Arab stereotypes. Iraq is an Arab nation, but so were at least 6 of the nations allied with Washington in that war. Newsday referred to the treacherous standards of Arab politics. Judith Miller in the New York Times claimed that the Gulf Cooperation Council, in typical Arab style, made a veiled reference to the presence of U.S. forces in the Gulf. Miller would never describe an Israeli leader as making veiled reference in typical Jewish style. U.S. News and World Report quoted Middle East specialist Judith Kipper on the devious nature of the Arab mind. We go in a straight line, they zigzag. They can say one thing in the morning, another thing at night, and really means a third thing. New Republic editor Martin Peretz warned us, nonviolence is foreign to political culture of Arabs, generally, and of Palestinians particularly, performing at his usual level of accuracy. New York Times columnist A.M. Rosenthal listed Iranians as Arabs. One of the media's favorite Middle East experts, Fuad Ajami, praised by New York Times columnist William Safar for the amazing way he reads the Arab mind, described Iraq as a brittle land with a little claim to culture and books and grand ideas. In fact, Iraq was a cradle of ancient and fertile civilization, and before it was destroyed by American bombs, Baghdad was a major center of literature, art, and architecture. NPR's Susan Stanberg, interviewing two Arab intellectuals, asked them to comment on an association in her mind, Arabs and death. They explained that, like everyone else, Arabs prefer life over death for themselves and their loved ones. Then she gave another association, Arabs and violence. Stanberg was a citizen of a country in which 25,000 homicides occurred each year, along with millions of muggings, rapes, and assaults. A country where they spent $300 billion annually on military and supported violent repressions through much of the third world, and which at the very moment of waging a murderous war against a vastly smaller and weaker Arab nation. And she was asking why Arabs were so violent. Let's continue. Methods of misrepresentation. We haven't noted the media's tendency to favor personality over issue, event over content, official positions over grievances, the atypical over the systemic. Supposedly the bias in the nature of the media themselves, specifically the imperfect practices of reporters, the visual nature of the camera, the limitations of time and budget, and the need to reduce complex development into a concise story. Certainly these are real factors, but news production is not a purely autonomous process, responsive only to its own internal imperatives. As we have seen, many distortions are of a more political nature and reveal a pattern of bias that favors the dominant class interest and status ideology. What we will look at in this chapter is not so much the content of propaganda themes as the method by which they are packaged and presented. Selectivity and deliberate omission. No communication can report everything that happens in public. Some selectivity is inevitable and by its nature conducive to a measure of bias. Still, we might aspire to standards of fairness and accuracy in reporting that try to develop a critical analysis of how and why the news is distorted. If the selection factor is determined principally by space limitations and the need to be entertaining, why are so many dreary news items, for example, visiting dignitaries at the White House and vacuous official announcements given consistently generous coverage, while many interesting and even sensational things are regularly suppressed? What is the principle of selectivity involved? Why was the Tylenol poisoning of several people by a deranged individual or individual big news, but the death of many more persons from unsafe drugs unmarketed by supposedly reputable companies not news? Why is a plane crash killing 43 passenger headlines news, while far more sensational story of the industrial brown lung poisoning of thousands of factory workers remains suppressed for years? Why does the press rapturously report the Pope's endless trips abroad while ignoring the involvement of his priests in the struggles against imperialism until the Pope denounces them for his radicalism? Why are they relatively limited repressive measures of leftist governments given saturation coverage, while the far more brutal oppressions and mass killings perpetrated by right-wing client states accorded only passing notice or ignored altogether? Why did the Kurds who were threatened by Iraq get saturation coverage for the 2 weeks in 1991, while hundreds and thousands of Iraqis who were put at risk or slaughtered outright by military forces received almost no mention? Why did the media repeatedly denounce Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge of Cambodia as mass murders in the 1970s, only to treat them with benign neglect when they became an indirect instrument of U.S. policy in 1990 to 91? For over 40 years, the corporate-owned media slighted or ignored outright the issues of national health insurance because of its aura of socialized medicine. Only in 1990 to 91, as large corporations demanded relief from the astronomical cost of employee health insurance, did the media then begin giving a subject of national health insurance serious attention. It became an issue in the media when it became ideologically safe, but still controversial at a policy level. There is nothing in the limitations of time and space that oblige the media to ignore third-party presidential candidates while assigning an army of journalists the agonizing task of having to file a news story every day of the campaign about a major candidate who seldom says anything new. But there is something about progressive third-party candidates themselves, their attempts at raising questions about the capital state, that makes them politically unsafe for national media coverage. As we have seen through much of this book, the single most common form of media misrepresentation is omission. Many omissions involve deliberate decisions with enough practice and without enough influence of dominant political culture. These decisions become almost automatic. Lives often hide in the things left unmentioned, and sometimes the unmentioned includes not just particular details of the story, but the entire story itself, and even ones about major events. For instance, in 1965, the Indonesian army overthrew President Ahmad Sukarno and embarked upon a murderous campaign to eradicate the Indonesian Communist Party and others, killing 500,000 people, some estimates as high as 1 million, in what was the greatest genocidal action since the Nazi Holocaust. Here was a sensational story, if there ever was one, but it was months before it appeared in a brief item in Time magazine, and yet another month before it was reported in the New York Times and treated as a salutary development. A Times editorial actually praised the Indonesian military for rightly playing its part with utmost caution. The press had little to say about the role in the CIA and the U.S. military in arming and assisting the Indonesian generals, and nothing to say about the economic interest supporting the military coup, nothing about the abolition of Sukarno's land reform, destruction of the Communist Party libraries, clinics, cooperatives, and schools for the poor, and massive dispossession of peasants, the widening gap between village rich and poor, the post-coup influx of American, Dutch, and Japanese corporations, the growth of Indonesia's national debt by foreign financiers, and the takeover of Indonesian minerals resources by foreign firms. So the Ku Klux Klan Nazi government in Indonesia. In 1976, the Indonesian military did an encore. It invaded East Timor to eradicate a government headed by Franklin, a popular leftist movement. The Indonesian army undertook a massive counterinsurgency campaign that brought death to some 80,000 to 100,000 persons. Since 1980, the army has taken another 100,000 Timorese lives. Here was another remarkable, sensational story the U.S. media treated almost as non-existent. It could be argued that places like Indonesia and East Timor are too remote to win the attention of the American press, noted for its generally deficient foreign news coverage. In fact, during Sukarno's reign, when Indonesia was taking an openly anti-imperialist stance, it was subjected to abundant negative coverage in the United States press. As for Timor, the New York Times Index gave full columns of citations to that obscure little island in 1975 as the Portuguese colonists abandoned the island and the Franklin populist movement was emerging victorious, a situation that concerned the White House and the CIA. In 1977, however, as the Indonesian general's annihilation reached awesome proportions, the Time Index gave East Timor only 5 lines. Politics, rather than geography, seem to determine the amount of coverage. When we see that news selectivity is likely to be on the side of those who have power, position, and wealth, we move from a liberal complaint about the press's poor performance to a radical analysis of how the press fulfills the system-supporting function all too well. Lies and face value transmission. Sometimes omissions are not enough and the press lends itself to dissemination of outright lies. All lies involve some degree of omission, but they also contain deliberate embellishment. They not only suppress information, they create disinformation. Untruths are repeated again and again in the major media, soon take on a life of their own to be passed on with little conscious awareness that a fabrication has been propagated. Not all lying is second nature for the news media, but along with the transformation of falsehood into unconscious fact, there is still plenty of plain old deliberate lies that can take conscious effort. Consider the instance, a report from Indonesia by Gerald Stone in the London Times, September 2nd, 1975, found that the Indonesian government-controlled press was spreading false stories about widespread atrocities by Franklin, the East Timorese popular force, as part of what Stone called a purposeful campaign to plant lies. But when Newsweek prepared Stone's story for American audience, it had him reporting on the devastation and bloodbath caused by Marxist Franklin Party. The magazine made it appear as if Stone had found the atrocity stories to be true, when in fact he found them to be false. In twisting Stone's story, Newsweek was guilty not just merely of inaccuracy, but deliberate fabrication. The major media not only go along with official disinformation, they readily launch their own energetic disinformation campaigns to buttress the policies of the national security state. During the 1980s and early 1990s, there were the mythical stories of the Soviets bankrolling and directing a global network of terrorists that they were engaging in chemical and bacteriological warfare in Laos and Cambodia, and they were behind a plot to shoot the Pope, and they knowingly shot down a Korean passenger plane that it supportedly strayed innocently into highly sensitive Soviet airspace. There were also stories about the Sandinista and Cuban governments were involved in a drug trade and that the Libyan hit team had infiltrated the United States to kill the president. These and other scare stories were floated by U.S. officialdom and given enthusiastic play by the corporate-owned news media. The press will go out of their way to promote an official disinformation story with embellishments of its own. As, for instance, did Marvin Kalb, who argued in 2 U.S. television specials filled with imaginary assertions and improbable fabrications that the Bulgarian communists and Soviet KGB were behind the attempt of Turkish fascists to kill the Pope John Paul II and in John Paul II. In 1991, during Senate confirmation hearings for a new CIA director, it came to light that the CIA had suppressed evidence suggesting that the Soviets were not linked to the assassination attempt. The media gave these startling revelations minimal play, being a little inclined to remind the public of how they had hyped the false story about a KGB Bulgarian connection. One way to lie is to accept at face value what are known to be lies, passing them to the public without adequate confirmation or countervailing response. Face value transmission has characterized the press's performance on almost every area of domestic and foreign policy, as we have seen throughout much of this book. Without saying a particular story is true or not, but treating it at face value, the press engages in the propagation of misinformation while maintaining it as merely non-committal and objective. When challenged on this, some reporters will argue that they cannot inject their own personal judgments into their reports, but no one is asking them to. In any case, they already do. My criticism is that the media seldom give range of information and views that might allow us to form opinions contrary to the official ones that permeate the news. No one is asking for more advocacy journalism, quote unquote. We already have quite a bit of that, and it is almost entirely mainstream and mostly conservative. What is needed is more content and broader context, the inclusion of facts that do not fit the prevailing ideology. Consider how some of the simple facts would have changed this report. In 1985, at the time of the Geneva arms talks, President Reagan described himself as optimistic because this is the first time the Soviets have ever publicly stated desire to reduce the number of their weapons. CBS News treated this incredible statement at face value, not bothering to point out that the Soviets had made repeated overtures to reduce nuclear and conventional weapons, including the previous year's unilateral offer to decrease the intermediate-range missiles in Europe from 800 to 162. In this CBS report, the appearance of objectivity as achieved through face value transmission prevailed over accuracy. Operating this in the dominant ideologic mode, the media have no reason to disbelieve the lies handed out by the government. Why should NBC believe Russians or Libyans rather than U.S. officials? The lie comes in the press's automatic readiness to do face value transmission, to act as an uncritical stenographer for the national security state, so neglecting the question of sparsity of non-existence of evidence of the implausibility of the claim, failure to seek confirming sources, overlooking contradictions of the story, asking a few penetrating or debunking questions, and ignoring opposing testimony, facts, and interpretations. It has become evident that the media has been lying when, by force of circumstances, they suddenly are forced to tell the truth. Thus, for 25 years, the U.S. media portrayed the Shah of Iran just as the State Department and big oil companies wanted, a benevolent ruler and modernizer of his nation, a likable public personage with a nary word about the thousands of people his savage security police had murdered and tortured. When the Iranian students occupied the U.S. Embassy in 1979 and took American hostages, one of their demands was that the U.S. media publish Shah's atrocities. For a short time, the American public was treated to a slice of the truth through testimony by persons who had suffered unspeakable outrages at the hands of one of the White House's favorite client state autocrats. We heard of parents and children tortured in front of each other, including one youngster displayed before the cameras who had his arms chopped off in the presence of his father. It left many Americans shocked, including members of Congress, who, like the rest of us, had been taught by the media to think of the Shah as an upright person worthy of U.S. aid. A dramatic example of media flip-flop is the treatment accorded President Ferdinand Marcos, the late dictator of the Philippines. For almost 20 years, Marcos was portrayed in the press just as the U.S. government wanted, as an American staunch ally and defender of democracy. Nothing was said about the repressive, unpopular nature of his rule. In 1985, however, popular feeling against the political and economic oppression of Marcos's 25-year-old
was running high in the Philippines. Even the Filipino military and business community had become fed up with Marcos' corruption and family favoritism. U.S. officials began to realize that the dictator might prove to be a liability. Another Batista Somoza Duvalier, Shah of Iran. That is a dictator who, instead of stabilizing his country and making it safe for corporate investors, was so unpopular as to become himself a catalyst for instability and popular rebellion. U.S. officials decided it was time for Marcos to exit the public stage before things got far out of hand. During this time, specifically between early January and late February 1986, a remarkable awakening occurred in the U.S. media. The New York Times suddenly discovered that the Marcos monopolies on cocoa, sugar, and other commodities were instruments of exploitation and economic oppression. Now, for the first time in 20 years, the Times no longer described Marcos as a defender of democracy, but as a tyrant. Suddenly, the media ascertained that Marcos was not a World War II hero, that he had fabricated his war record, and rather than fighting the Japanese, he had been a Japanese collaborator. Suddenly, media also discovered that Marcos and his wife had been stashing large sums of public funds into personal holdings, including investment in the United States. Reporting on Marcos' 1986 election campaign against Corazon Aquino, NBC concluded the election was marred by acts of fraud and violence, as all elections have been under President Marcos. But why had not NBC or any other major news organizations ever told us about previous elections held under the Marcos regime? If the fraud and violence was known, why had it been kept a secret for 20 years? Only when Marcos had fallen from grace from Washington did the news media suddenly say things about him they never thought of saying years before. But admitting being privy to a truth long unspoken, the media demonstrated that they had kept it from us. False balancing. In accordance with the canons of good journalism, reporters are supposed to balance their stories, tapping competing sources to get both sides of an issue. However, as we have seen, even when statements from both sides are presented, they often are not accorded equal space, position, and frequency. There are several types of news exposure. First, there is one shot coverage. A story is reported once, usually without prominent play, passing almost unnoticed before large publics, caught only by those who are especially attuned to them, if even by them. Then there is sporadic coverage. An item gets intermittent mention, appearing once or twice, disappearing, then reappearing weeks or months later for another passing mention. Finally, there is saturation coverage. Such thing appears as a lead story in the evening news and the front page on days on end, and is given the kind of emphasis and repetition that makes it a visible part of the political agenda. Information opinions that are troublesome to the powers that be are almost likely to get one-shot coverage, if at all. So give me 1 second, glad you could join us today. All right, let's continue. The rule that says journalists must present both sides of the story overlooks the fact that both sides may not be all sides. Important but less visible factors extending beyond the immediate pros and cons of the issues are habitually shut out. As we have seen throughout this book, these unexamined assumptions prefigure the limits of discussion about most domestic and foreign policy issues. Even when insufficient ruling of getting both sides often falls by the wayside. As noted in earlier pages on almost any issue, official sources are heavily favored over sources that are critical of the official view. A study of the National Public Radio evening shows, all things considered, found that the administration sources outnumbered responses from non-administration sources by nearly 2-1. The same is true of right versus left sources. Looking at NPR news programs, one critic concludes that right-wing spokespeople are often interviewed alone, while leftists, on infrequent occasions that appear, are almost always offset by conservatives. To those who have a position and wealth are less likely to be slighted in the news reports than in their critics, and they also are more likely to be accorded adequate space to respond to the infrequent occasions when they are attacked. The media are less energetic in the search for a competing viewpoint if it must be elicited from labor leaders, environmentalists, feminists, peace and disarmament advocates, communists, civil rights supporters, Black or Latino protesters, third world insurgents, American supporters of third world insurgents, the poor and the oppressed. Regarding media coverage of Africa, one critic remarks, even when American newsmen take the trouble to visit Black Africa, they seem incapable of talking to ordinary people about what is happening in their country. For instance, Time and Newsweek articles on the independence struggle in Namibia concentrate on the concerns of South African military commanders and officials in Pretoria, Geneva, and Washington, offer no statements from the Namibian revolutionaries or any other independence-minded Namibia. What the press lacks in balance, it sometimes makes up for in false balancing, as when it tries to create an impression of even-handedness by placing equal blames on parties that are not equally culpable. Thus, for years, the news ascribed the killings in Guatemala and El Salvador as to extremists, both the right and left, when in fact, almost all killings were done by rightist death squads linked to the military and the military itself. The false balancing created a false impression. A massive state terrorism against popular organizations was reduced to a gang war between rightist and leftist outlaws. False balancing also allows journalists to adopt a condemnatory view of all sides, both those who are fighting for and those fighting against social justice. In this way, the press manages to keep an equal distance from both falsehood and truth. Another way to stack the deck with false balancing is to apply double standard in interviews. For instance, Nightline host Ted Koppel, a friend and admirer of the conservative like George Will and Henry Kissinger, has gained a reputation for asking probing inquiries, but he challenges viewpoints that veer somewhat leftward far more vigorously than those that stay snugly mainstream. Hostile probes can sometimes give a respondent the opportunity to offer clarifying arguments, assuming the person is up to the task and allowed enough time. But the overall impression left by an antagonistic interview is that there is something highly questionable about the interviewee. Conversely, the effect of a friendly interview is to send a cue to the audience that the respondent is to be troubled and believed. Koppel is especially non-confrontational, almost deferential, when interviewing his friend Dr. Kissinger and other notables from the national security establishment. The media claim to give us a balanced opinion, offering a diversity of sources, but such diversity is usually a bogus. False diversity creates a misleading impression of often debate and pluralistic choice in the media. Thus, on one ABC Nightline show, host Koppel introduced Richard Pearl as the Pentagon hardliner, against who was pitted Richard Burt, the State Department moderate. Burt, the hardline Cold Warrior and cruise missile advocate, was considered a moderate by Koppel. And for even more diversity and balance, there was a third guest, former Secretary of State Alexander Haig, a Nixon hardliner and Cold War stalwart. The balance through diversity allowed for no critical questioning of the White House's foreign policy. In the major media, both sides of an issue sometimes are nothing more than two variations of what gets essentially one side. Framing and labeling. The most effective propaganda in which which relies on framing rather than on falsehood. By bending the truth rather than breaking it, using emphasis, nuance, innuendo, and peripheral embellishments, communication can create a desired impression without resorting to explicit advocacy and without departing too far from the appearance of objectivity. Framing is achieved in the way the news is packaged, the amount of exposure, the placement from front page or back, lead story or last, the tone of presentation, sympathetic or slighting, the accompanying headlines and visual effect, and the labeling and vocabulary. Just short of lying, the media can mislead us in a variety of ways, telling us what to think about a story before we have a chance to think about it ourselves. One common framing method is to select labels and other vocabulary designed to convey politically loaded messages. These labels and phrases, like the mask in a Greek drama, convey positive or negative cues regarding events and persona, often without the benefit and usually as a substitution for supportive information. Thus, on CBS television news, Dan Rather referred retrospectively on the Black Civil Rights Movement and student anti-war movement as the civil disturbances of the 60s. How different an impression would have been created had he labeled them movements for peace and justice or movements against military intervention and for racial equality. As with commodities, so with the news, labels are unavoidable, but one should be alerted to false labeling or labeling that distorts or editorializes more than it informs. Other examples of such labeling. A news story in the Los Angeles Times described Nicaraguan leader Daniel Ortega's denunciation of U.S. policies being as strident as ever, implying that Ortega was given to excessive and unjustified attacks. The report said nothing about U.S. policy itself or about the content of Ortega's criticism, which readers may not have found strident. A report in the Washington Post described a province in El Salvador as guerrilla-infested rather than guerrilla-controlled or post-revolutionary, thereby reducing the insurgent populace to a kind of lice. Throughout the 1984 press coverage of the Lebanon crisis, the press incessantly referred to the Soviet-made anti-aircraft missiles and other arms possessed by the Syrians and Lebanese. But at no time were the Israeli arms described as U.S.-made, which they were. The impression left was that the Soviets were somehow the instigators in what was called actually an Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Moscow's arms reduction overtures during the 1980s were repeatedly labeled unsympathetically as a Soviet peace initiative. But the Kremlin smile campaign and Gorbachev's disarmament threats, ABC's Barry Dinsmore opined that Moscow had adopted a friendly approach only because previous strong-arm methods unspecified had failed to persuade its Western allies. The Kremlin's peace overtures were just an attempt to enhance the Soviet image of Western Europe, warned Dan Rather of CBS, who noted that the U.S. rejected as not negotiable a Soviet proposal for the mutual non-use of military force in Europe. No lie was uttered here. The Soviets indeed did make the proposal, and the United States did reject it. But by labeling the Soviet move as another peace propaganda pitch, Rather let us know that the U.S. rejection was the only sensible move, with no explanation why it was so. Before his country crumbled from under him, Mikhail Gorbachev was described by WPAT Radio in New York as Soviet boss Gorbachev. WPAT would never refer to U.S. boss Bush. Israeli authorities rounded up hundreds of Palestinian political leaders, administrators, teachers, journalists, intellectuals, and anyone else who might provide leadership to the Palestinian community, holding them in administrative detention for years on end without charge. In effect, they were hostages to Israeli rule. But throughout 1991, the U.S. news media invariably referred to them as prisoners, not hostages. Arab resistance groups, however, had no prisoners. They only held hostages. As of 1992, Israel held 53 UN personnel as hostages. Almost all were Arab employees for the United Nations Relief and Workplace Agency. U.S. media never labeled them as hostages. Who is and who is not a terrorist? Who is and who is not a terrorist in the media is a matter of politics. Leftist guerrillas with a wide popular base are often referred to as terrorists. Right-wing mercenaries financed by the CIA who attack unarmed villagers, farm cooperatives, clinics, and schools in countries like Nicaragua, Angola, and Mozambique are rebels. State terrorism is what leftist governments do to defend themselves against these rebels, never what the United States does to suppress popular movements in a score of countries. The Southwest Africa's People Organization, SWAPO, struggling to liberate Namibia from white South African occupation, was described as a hardline Marxist movement by the San Francisco Chronicle. No hardline labeling was applied in the story to SWAPO's opponent, the often murderous Pretoria government that colonized and plundered Namibia for 30 years. The graying of reality. Much news media framing is designed not to excite, but to neutralize. While we think of the press as geared to crisis and sensationalism, often its task is just the opposite, dedicated to the graying of reality, blurring of popular grievances and social inequalities. It is in this muted media reality, those who raise their voices too strongly against the bland tide can be made to sound quite shrill. Instead of neutralizing themselves as observers, reporters and editors are more likely to neutralize their subject matter, giving it an innocence it may not deserve. One way to do this is by applying gloss over euphemism and passive phrases. We have already noted how the New York Times reported that President Salvador Allende of Chile died in the Manila Palace when he had actually been murdered by the military. The Times turned the 1973 Chilean coup, in which tens of thousands were victimized, into a neutral event, using bland phrases like the armed forces never took power and telling us that chaos was caused by the communists brought by the military. When men, women, and children in the villages of Morezen province were massacred by the Salvadoran army, the Times described it as a military operation in which 500 civilians reportedly died in El Mozote. The Washington Post treated the Morezen massacre with a sentence like, a survivor broke down only when speaking of what he said were the deaths of her children, and like so much else in the civil war that is racking this tiny country, these conflicting accounts are impossible to verify. The destruction of trade unions and other popular organizations and the many acts of oppression, murder, and torture by fascist military regime in Turkey were described by the Washington Post as quote-unquote controversial measures and as a drive to restrict political dissent. We learned from General Kenan Evren, the despot of Turkey, has a down-to-earth approach and involves himself in the rough and tumble of everyday politics. And his current crackdown has all but stamped out terrorism. Of his democratic opponents were terrorists, and the Evren regime itself was not engaged in terrorism. Faced with a genocide in East Timor perpetrated by the Indonesian military, complete with widespread burning of crops and intensive aerial bombardment of the countryside to starve out and destroy the population that supported the guerrillas, the Washington Post could neutralize as follows. More than 100,000 islanders, 1/6 of the population, died in the famine and disease brought on by the hostilities. And the warfare between the Indonesians and the Franklin forces further disrupted the fragile agrarian economy and caused heavy casualties. The Indonesians did not starve out and massacre multitudes. The warfare impersonally caused heavy casualties. 16 years after a democratically elected president was murdered in Chile, the New York Times' Shirley Christian was still glossing over the event with phrases like, President Allende died in the nature of the coup. In 1991, the Washington Post reported that El Salvador deep hatreds and the killing of civilians had left some 75,000 dead. The use of passive voice that conveniently avoids telling us who did the killing. As for South Africa, we are told by the Times that a protest by black squatters led to clashes with the police, in which 18 people died. What has led to a clash meeting? Didn't the police open fire on the demonstrators? How did the people die? Was it from heat stroke, heart attack, or were they not killed by the police? The article does not tell us so. In another article, the Times noted that Mozambican countryside has been devastated. By whom? Was it not the South African-backed mercenary Renamo forces that for years deliberately wreaked death and terror upon the civilian population of Mozambique? According to the neutralizing Times, the devastation was a result of the conflict that pitted the anti-communist Renamo against the Marxist government. And on Angola, the Washington Post reported scores of government health centers have been burned down in the countryside, apparently by rebels. If the word apparently had not been inserted, the report would have sounded less measured, less objective, but would have been more truthful. The rebels were the right-wing United Forces that received $50 million a year in covert military aid from the United States of America. Another way to neutralize the news is by scanting its content. We noted how the media are able to reduce political campaigns to a string of issueless, trivial pseudo-events and to feed stories about labor management conflicts, political protests in revolutionary and socialist countries without ever telling us much about the substance, about interests and goals of motivating event makers. When political struggles are deprived of their content, as when positions taken in opposition to U.S. policy are never explained in their substance, we are left with the presumption that the conflict is caused by an innately hostile adversary. By slighting content and dwelling on surface details, the media are able to neutralize the truth while giving an appearance of thoroughly treated the subject. Auxiliary embellishments. Through the use of various peripheral framing devices, a story can be packaged so as to influence our perception of its content. The most common accoutrements in the print media is, of course, the headline. Not only can headlines mislead anyone who skims a page without reading a story, they can create the dominant slant of a story, establishing a mindset that influences how we read the story tags. Thus, it takes a careful reading of New York Times story headlined American flyer shot down in Iraq recounts horrors after capture to realize that the pilot is not talking about he suffered at the hands of his captor, but is voicing his regrets at delivering death and destruction upon the Iraqi people. When the House Select Committee on Narcotics Abuse and Control investigated drug trafficking in Central America, the Washington Post ran this headline: Hill panel finds no evidence linking Contras to drug smuggling. It was false, according to the House Chair's Committee, Charles Rangel, in a letter the Post refused to publish. Rangel wrote, "Your headline says we drew one conclusion, when we in fact reached a different one." Rather than finding there was no evidence on Contra involvement in drug smuggling, the committee actually determined there was strong need for further congressional investigation into Contra drug allegations. Another Post story reporting on the income gap separating the rich and from the middle class and the poor was wider than it had been for 40 years, carried this upbeat headline: number of poor Americans at lowest level since 1990. Political cartoons and caricatures are also common embellishment, time-honored forms of editorial comment, and readily recognized as such. Less easily detected are the news photographs that often send us a cue about what to think of a story before we get a chance to read it. Acts of violence, including labor disputes and anti-war protests, are more likely to appear as news photos than less damning shots, showing large disciplined crowds making their point. Individual demonstrators who convey a kooky appearance will more likely catch the camera's eye than those of conventional deportment, the purpose not being to highlight the unusual, but to delegitimate the protesters. Throughout the 1989 and 1990, whenever demonstrations against communist governments in Eastern Europe were photographed, it was always with long-range shots from an elevated position, giving sympathetic analysis to the size of the crowd. Demonstrations against U.S. government policy in the United States, however, are more likely to be tight out of cuts of relatively few of the protesters, thereby giving no indication of the immensity of the crowd. Photographs of political leaders can be very political. The President of the United States enjoys almost daily favorable pictorial treatment in the major print and electronic media and is only rarely pictured unsympathetically. However, favorable photoplay is less likely to be accorded heads of state who have been defined as adversaries. A New York Times magazine ran an article about communist Russia by David Shipler entitled Russia, A People Without Heroes, was accompanied by no less than 10 photographs, all of which were unusually muted, grainy, and thickly ragged borders with captions like Russians have become amorphous, so dispersed because there are no roots, foundations accompanying a picture of Russians going down an escalator. Photographs accompanying this article conveyed an impression of glumness, oppression, and joylessness, and were clearly meant to do so. A 60-minute report on intelligence work during World War II turned into a Cold War message and a plug for government secrecy. As Harry Reasoner announced, today we rush to disclose everything. We must remember that some secrets are worth keeping secret. A screen showed Nazi troops marching past Hitler, then a quick cut to Soviet troops marching in Red Square. Then the camera invited us to equate the Soviet Union with Hitlerian world conquest. Whether one agreed with the question or not, the point is, it was made quite evocatively through a visual effect that evaded rather than encouraged the reader's critical judgment. Another blatant example of Cold War photo manipulation was provided by NBC's Tom Brokaw, who talked of how the Soviet people had suffered from the crimes of Stalin. As Brokaw's old and familiar newsreel cuts from World War II was shown of a Soviet peasant woman weeping over her son's body that had been killed by the German invaders, and another shot of 5 Soviet partisans hanged by the Nazis. These were passed off as visuals of Stalin's crimes. It is said that cameras don't lie, but we must remember that the liar Tom Brokaw and other liars use cameras. As anyone who sat through a Hollywood romance on adventure film might know, music is another evocative media embellishment that can play on our feelings. During the Cold War, television news reports on the Soviet Union were accompanied with tunes that were either mournful or menacing. In the spring of 1984, National Public Radio, all things considered, did a report on the kinds of music it noted as background to the news. And especially Durst-like theme was identified by Noah Adams as used for side stories, especially from Eastern Europe. The Adams showed nothing politically manipulative about using music in his way testifies to the unexamined nature of the political orthodoxy so fostered. Such use of thematic background music is designed to elicit mood, eliciting receptive feelings and deterring resistant thoughts. Newscasters use themselves as auxiliary embellishments. They create a smooth delivery, have a trained voice, and restrained demeanors, and try to convey an impression of objective detachment that places them above rough and tumble of their subject matter. Newscasters, and in a different way, newspaper editorials and columnists affect a knowing, authoritative style and tone designed to foster credibility and an aura of certitude. One recalls A.J. Liebman's caustic observation: the reluctance to admit ignorance is what most of this press as strong as the refusal to accept reality. So what we sometimes end up with is authoritative ignorance, as emphatically expressed in remarks like, "How will this situation end? No one can say for sure," or "Only time will tell," or "That remains to be seen." Better translated as, "I don't know, and if I don't, then no one else does." Sometimes the aura of credibility is preserved by palming off trite truisms as penetrating truths. So news people learn to fashion sentences like, "Unless the strike is settled soon, the two sides will be in for a long and bitter struggle." And, quote, "The space launching will take place as scheduled if no unexpected problems arise." And because of heightened voter interest, Election Day turnout is expected to be heavy. And unless Congress acts soon, the bill is not likely to go anywhere. Placement. Probably the most common method of framing is placement. It is a report telecast as the lead story of the evening or a given just passing superficial reference. It is unfurled across the top of the front page or buried as a minor item on an inside page. Troublesome stories that are not suppressed, ignored, or completely truth-twisted can still be buried in obscure places. Placement is used for graying reality. We already noted how, during the 1990-91 Gulf War, the press gave uncritical top plate a sensationalistic tale about Iraqi troops wrenching over 300 Kuwaiti babies from incubators that were sent back to Iraq. Only months later, the Washington Post passingly quote a Kuwaiti physician who said no incubators were stolen. Such as it was, the retraction was buried on page 825 in the very long story about post-war conditions in Kuwait. In this instance, the truth received only kind of a muffled one-shot coverage, reaching few people who read the original horror tale. Also, after the war, Kuwait detained, tortured, and summarily executed undisclosed numbers of Palestinians. The New York Times reported this news on tiny item on page 88. There was another sensational and horrific story that received muted treatment because the White House's allies were committing the atrocities. What if it turned out that one of the CIA's most brutal client-state dictators was dealing with drugs? Should not get prominent play. Certainly if it were some general like Noriega who had fallen from White House favor, but not if it were General Mohammad Zia al-Haq of Pakistan. The New York Times, in minuscule paragraph on an inside page, reported that the drug trade rose sharply after General Zia seized power, and senior figures in the U.S. government were said to have ties to drug traffickers. Here was another sensational revelation that, because of its foreign policy ramifications, earned about as much attention as a weather story. Likewise, the Amnesty International report that Turkish authorities routinely torture political prisoners and that 250,000 political detainees in the 1980s, almost all were tortured. Since Turkey has long been treated by the State Department and the U.S. media as one of the citadels of the free world, the New York Times saw torture in Turkey as nothing to get excited about, given a 2-inch mention on the bottom of page A6. One can only imagine the attention saturation coverage such a story would have received if 250 prisoners had been tortured by the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. It is often said that lies spread like wildfire, while the truth is supposedly plods along, never catching up because it is not as sensational, nor as timely, hence not as newsworthy. This view has been elevated to some kind of unavoidable law of human communication. But actually, there is no objective reason the refutation cannot be given equal exposure and treated with the same urgency and importance as the original falsehood. The truth is often much more sensational and revealing than the propaganda lie, as the above examples might indicate. Truth wins a smaller audience not because it is less interesting, but because it is treated as less interesting and less important way. If the truth never catches up with the lie, it is not because of some natural law of communication, but because the way the truth and lies are communicated. Conscious decision and deliberate effort determine that the lie should be prominently displayed because it serves the dominant interest, and the truth shall be ignored outright or at best poorly accommodated because it is too damaging to those same interests. In sum, as highly skilled specialists, news manufacturers are more than merely conduits for official and moneyed interests. They help create, embellish, and give life to the news with an array of stereotyped, often misleading, well-executed images, tones, evasions, nuances, suppressions, and fabrications that lend confirmation of the ruling ideologic viewpoint in a process that is not immediately recognized as being the propaganda it is. Their authoritative voices on radio and television, their decisive wrap-ups on reassuring appearance before the camera, and their unlit columns of system-containing stones and commentaries help us believe that that's the way it is, quote unquote. At the same time, the media message preempts the public agenda and muffles out genuine public discourse on what the world might really be like and how we might want to change it. So that's it. That's the 2 chapters. Let's get started. This is the insult session. The Ku Klux Klan Nazi white scoundrels of the American government. We're going to discuss them at length, and their press, their fabrication of their mafia press of white thugs, their Ku Klux Klan press. American propaganda themes. Regardless of who is involved in manufacturing the news, one can detect persistent themes on how the mainstream press presents our country's role in the world and among us. American virtue and anti-Americanism. Let's talk about this. Okay, so to maintain the image of ill-defined or overextended U.S. foreign policy, the news media say little about the U.S. role in financing, equipping, training, advising, and directing the repressive military apparatus that exists in U.S. client states around the world. Little about the mass killings of entire villages, the paramilitary death squads, the torture and disappearances. This is the American government. Washington, torture, disappearance. They are Ku Klux Klan Nazi government of the United States. That is what they do. They, hide the stuff
through their media. They hide their torture and disappearances. They are racist white scoundrels, sick racists of the U.S. government.
So continue on. Thus, when Time magazine devoted a full-page story to torture throughout the world, the U.S. came out looking like Snow White.
So that's what you do. You hide the torture. You hide your criminal government of white Ku Klux Klan Nazis, and then you get away with, they're Snow White whites.
Okay, following the official line, the national media will readily deny that the United States harbors aggressive intention against all other governments and will dismiss such charges by them as just so much anti-American propaganda and evidence of their aggressive intent towards us. So basically, anytime a nationalist movement comes in, they'll call it, anti-American propaganda, and they're aggressive towards America. So you criticize America, you're anti-American. That's what it is. So if America murders 100,000 Indians in Latin America, you're anti-American because you criticize them, because they're Ku Klux Klan Nazi Americans. Okay, reports of the impending invasion of Cuba circulated widely throughout Central America, but in the United States, stories were suppressed by the Associated Press and UPI and by all other major networks, newspapers, and news weeklies. That was the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion. Okay, in an impressively unanimous sort of self-censorship, some 75 publications rejected a report offered by the editors of The Nation in 1960 detailing U.S. preparations for the invasion. Fidel Castro's accusation that the United States was planning to invade Cuba was dismissed by the New York Times as shrill anti-American propaganda, and by time as Castro's continued tawdry little melodrama of invasion. When Washington broke diplomatic relations with Cuba in January 1961 after Castro started nationalizing U.S. corporate investments and instituting social programs for the poor, the Times explained what snapped U.S. patience was a new propaganda offensive from Havana, charging that the U.S. was plotting an imminent invasion of Cuba. Yet after the Bay of Pigs invasion proved to be something more than a fragment of Castro's anti-Americanism, there was almost a total lack of media criticism regarding its moral and legal impropriety. Instead, editorial commentary referred to the disappointing fiasco and disastrous attempt. Revelations about the full extent of U.S. involvement, including the CIA training camp in Guatemala, began to appear during the post-invasion period in the same press that earlier had denied such things. Perspectives that the retrospective admissions of U.S. involvement were discussed unapologetically and treated as background for further moves against Cuba. Perspectives that did not implicitly assume the U.S. policy were well-intentioned and supportive of democratic interests were excluded from media commentary. So basically the Bay of Pigs, Castro was crazy. He said there was going to be a Bay of Pigs invasion, and there was a Bay of Pigs invasion, and then they blacked it out. That's the white media. That's the Ku Klux Klan Nazi American government and their white mafia press. It's a mafia press of white thugs and scoundrels. That is what they do. Okay. So anti-American Shiite Muslims during the 1979 hostage crisis, when ABC asked an expert whether being a Shiite Muslim meant being anti-American, he replied that it did. Over footage of Muslims crowds chanting, "God is great," ABC commentator Frank Reynolds voiced what was supposed was their real mourning, hatred of America. CBS's Walter Cronkite spoke of Muslim hatred of this country. They are not hateful of America. They're hateful of your Ku Klux Klan Nazi colonial imperialists. They're not hateful of America. They're hateful of your Ku Klux Klan colonialist racist thugs, is what Walter Cronkite should be educated about. They hate your colonial oppression, your theft of their resources, your theft of their land. They're racist Ku Klux Klan scoundrels that they hate. Okay, after noting that the Ethiopian Revolution of 1974 grew out of a general despair with prevailing conditions without much ideology behind it, the Washington Post concluded that the revolution had an anti-American thrust. So the anti-Ethiopian Revolution had an anti-American thrust. So basically that was that thing. Then we talked about if masses of demonstrators and rioters in other countries denounce that policy as an imperialistic and oppressive, it can only be because they suffer from anti-Americanism. So you murdered our daughter, you murdered my brother, and so, we're complaining about you, but then you're anti-American, right? You murdered our children and you're anti-American. That's what it is. They're Ku Klux Klan scoundrel whites. It is a Nazi group of Ku Klux Klan American government thugs. Okay, that's what it is. So let's continue. the non-existence of imperialism, the process by which the dominant interests of one country expropriate the land, labor markets, capital, and natural resources of another, and neo-imperialism, the process of expropriation that occurs without direct colonization, are both unmentionable in the U.S. media. So the fact that the U.S. is neo-colonialist, they don't have direct colonization because they don't set up, they don't set up a colony where they collect the cash. They just get the cash, off the generals, the murder generals that they put in power. It's the same as a colonial regime. It's the same as colonialism. The U.S. government has a violent Ku Klux Klan colonialism and anti-third world, anti-hateful, hateful American white colonialism against the third world. Media commentators, like political leaders, treat corporate investment as a solution to third world poverty and indebtedness rather than as a cause. The profits reaped from the exploitation of cheap and oppressed labor markets in an impoverished country like El Salvador are much higher than would be procured by stateside industries. Of the hundreds of reporters about El Salvador in the major broadcast and print media in recent years, few, if any, treat the basic facts about U.S. imperialism. Okay, so Texaco, all of these banks, you'll pay Salvadoran workers subsistence wages to produce everything from aluminum products to baking powder, transformer steel, and computers. Almost all for export markets and all done without minimum wage laws, occupational safety, environmental controls, and other costly hindrances to capital accumulation. So the Hispanic people of El Salvador, they don't get any protection. They just get minimum wage. They're racist, Ku Klux Klan Nazi American government. It's a Ku Klux Klan group of murderers of the American government. We are asked to believe that third world people are poor because that has long been their condition. They live in countries that are overpopulated, or there is something about their land, culture, or temperament that makes them unable to cope. Subsistence wages, forced displacement from homesteads, the plunder of natural resources, the lack of public education and public health programs, the suppression of independent labor unions and other democratic forces by U.S.-supported police states, such things that we were to believe the way they remain untreated in the media, have nothing to do with the poverty in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So it's racism. They're racism. They're culturally inferior. That's why they can't take our police state. Our police state where you kidnap, a poor 3-year-old girl. You kidnap her and then cut them into pieces in front of the mom. That's, that's real way of thinking. That's the real, third world. The third world is culturally inferior because they get angry at the racist Ku Klux Klan Nazis of the American government for doing that. They are, inferior culturally. That is because the U.S. are mentally sick whites. They're sick racists. They have a racist white sickness of the U.S. government. Okay, so continuing on. So Chile, Turkey, Pakistan, Zaire, and Honduras, South Africa, El Salvador, Guatemala, South Korea, and Indonesia, all are client states of the United States. Okay, they serve the Western, the Western capitalist interests. As already noted, the everyday acts of repression, torture, and assassination perpetrated by these regimes with the aid and assistance of U.S. counterinsurgency agencies are usually ignored by the major media. The scale and savagery of political repression is less a factor. So basically, they ignore the political repression. They ignore the assassination, torture, and repression. So if the media ignores it, then you're thinking that it's not really wrong to torture third world Hispanics, Africans, and Asians because you're Ku Klux Klan Nazi government. That's what it is. So basically, the scale and savagery of political repression is less a factor of commanding the media's attention than the politics of victim and victimizer. The left is suppressing the right, as with the treatment of dissidents in communist countries. Then the American public is treated to protracted press coverage. But if the repression is by the right against the left, even if of much greater scope and ferocity, the news is suppressed or downplayed and given none of the detailed repetition and strong editorial commentary needed to create a climate of opinion on this issue. So basically, you suppress right on left violence, right, like right Ku Klux Klan murders of Hispanics, blacks, and Asians, but left on right, where nationalist Vietnamese want to nationalize their oil, you make it a big deal because you're Ku Klux Klan Nazi American government. That's what it is. So continue on by portraying the military autocrats as striking a course between the violent extremes of left and right. The press is able with one stroke to exonerate them from any complicity in the government-sponsored mass terror and transform them into a middle-of-the-road, peaceable leadership that is potentially, if not actually, democratic. So extreme violence, you can turn into moderates, right? You have a death squad, murder, kidnapper, and, an enforced disappearance.
Hitler type Nazi in power, a death squad, enforced disappearance. Number one, military person, and you can turn them into a moderate. That's the U.S. government. That's the art of the U.S. press. The racist Ku Klux Klan scoundrels of the American media and their government. Okay, so by portraying military art against quotes and striking a source. Okay, so the NBC News in 1980 described the government of El Salvador, which had been terrorizing and murdering peasants and workers for several decades, as moderate. Okay, so the murderous regime of El Salvador is a moderate regime. The right-wing fascist regime of El Salvador that disappears people is moderate. The New York Times repeated the State Department line that the moderate Salvadoran government was implementing the most sweeping land reform and fastest ever carried out in Latin America, so fast as soon to become indiscernible. Other junta activities received less media fanfare. By 1990, some 75,000 people, mostly non-combatants, had been killed by the military. Over 1 million refugees, or 1 out of every 4 Salvadorans, had abandoned their home regions or fled the country entirely. The military moderation having proven too much for them. So they were moderate regimes. But, millions of people were running away from the regime. So why is that? Because they're Ku Klux Klan Nazi government. South Africa is another repressive regime that has been morally renovated by the U.S. corporate news media. By 1990, the government of F.W. de Klerk was being portrayed as charting a courageous middle course between right-wing white supremacists and the Xhosa community of African National Congress. Thousands of people were killed in what the U.S. press repeatedly called bloody tribal battles, ethnic fighting, and black-on-black violence between the opposing clans of the ANC Xhosa and the Nkatha Zulu 25. Okay, the U.S. media never labeled the bloodletting in Northern Ireland or Yugoslavia white-on-white violence. Government troops and police are described as trying to stop blacks chanting war cries from slashing and stabbing each other. Such reports elicit the racist image of African tribal warriors who are too primitive and violent to rule themselves. That's what the U.S. government does. They're, pro-apartheid, racist, seething, angry, white, sick racists of the American government. They have a mental racist sickness to support South African apartheid and support the South African regime against the African National Congress. That is the U.S. government. And they hide this stuff. They become champions of blacks. We're, big champions. Racist scoundrel, Ku Klux Klan, rapists, torturers, and murderers of blacks is what we say. Okay, the New York Times. So then Gotha Buthelezi, the New York Times enthusiastically described Buthelezi as a man of regal bearing and a leader with whom both President de Klerk and Nelson Mandela must reckon. In fact, far from opposing apartheid, Buthelezi himself is a product and beneficiary of that system, having been appointed head of the KwaZulu-Bantustan, one of a number of racially segregated puppet regime homelands set up by the apartheid regime. Democracy does not exist in KwaZulu. Chief Buthelezi tolerates no opposition parties and no dissent. While posing as a black nationalist, he has secretly collaborated with the apartheid regime and the military, receiving large sums of money to carry out his attacks against ANC. His Nkatha forces have been secretly trained by the South African Defense Forces of the apartheid regime and are linked to terrorist groups like Renamo in Mozambique. The U.S. media have done less to probe the links between the government and Nkatha than the censored South African press. So basically, the U.S. media hides, Nkatha Buthelezi. Buthelezi is like a Somoza, right? We know Somoza, he's a Hispanic champion, like America puts Somoza on the propaganda piece, pictures of Somoza as a big Hispanic, and say that we're great to Hispanics. Same way Buthelezi, we're great to blacks. That's because they're Ku Klux Klan, delusional, sick whites is why it is. Far from being nonviolent and moderate, Buthelezi has waged a war of terror and murder against ANC supporters, most of whom are unarmed. Buthelezi has been designated a Zulu leader by the U.S. media, but surveys reveal that relatively few Zulus outside his Nkatha organization support him, the majority identifying as feeling closest to Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. So that he's just not a popular leader. Just like Somoza, it's not a popular leader. They want to get this guy, this crazy guy out of power, this murderer, this, disappear, this kidnapper of the people, this, torture of the people. They want to get him out. But the sick whites of Washington, the Ku Klux Klan, sickness of the American government won't allow it, and they hide this stuff. Evil, power-hungry leftists. Almost after half a century of propaganda, designations like Marxist, communist, leftist, and leftist guerrillas create their own automatic negative framing. Thus, in regard to the invasion of Grenada in 1983, the New York Times editorial decided the fear was real that Grenada can infect the Caribbean region. with militant leftism, right? Maurice Bishop's wanting land reform, they call him a militant leftist. That is, it's just outright lies. It's outright lies. It's like hallucinations by the mentally sick whites of the U.S. media and their government to call it leftist, crazy leftist. It's mentally sickness of the Ku Klux Klan government of the United States. And actually, the distinguishing characteristic of Marxists and leftists, as opposed to rightists, is a commitment to the kind of social and economic change that benefits the less favored mass of peasants and workers at the expense of wealthy classes of the third world and Western financial interests. The revolutionary Marxist left is committed to using a country's resources and labor for the purposes of eliminating poverty and illiteracy and serving the social needs of the populace rather than the profit needs of rich investors. So leftist means helping the people get better, taking care of them when they're sick, making sure they get food on the table, whereas the rightist is a commitment to murder the population, population control and extermination by the Ku Klux Klan Nazi government of the United States, and also, Western financial interests make a big killing. From the U.S. news media, one learns that leftists and communists are not persons motivated by longings for justice, equality, and decent life, but conspirators who take advantage of such longings. Discussing the struggles in Guatemala and El Salvador, Washington Post editor and former CIA agent, again, the CIA agent of the Washington Post, Philip Graylin, referred to communist exploitation of grievances and the communist contribution to instability. Leftists are trying to create instability. That's because they're sick whites, sick racists of the American government. They have a Ku Klux Klan sickness. If they initiate land reform, public health programs, and literacy programs, it is only to win popular support and further secure their power base. The media usually do not explain why right-wing leaders are above using popular programs to secure their power base. Such reforms will defeat the very purpose of their existence, which is to live well off the impoverished labor of others. So the leftists are crazy because they try to help their people. The rightists, no matter how many people they murder and torture and rape, they're fine. They're fine because they're sick Ku Klux Klan whites of the U.S. government. Okay, so continuing on. But even when reporting such positive gestures, like the revolutionary governments in Cuba, Vietnam, Libya, or Nicaragua, when they make friendly overtures, the media, the U.S. press perpetuates the stereotype of communists as sinister aggressors. So even when Castro made what's behind Castro's softer tone of New York Times, basically Fidel is talking as he wants to improve relations with the United States. But, basically the Times analysis made nothing of Castro's stated desire to ease tension and instead presented the rest of the story from the U.S. government's perspective. It noted that most Reagan administration officials seemed skeptical. The administration continues to believe that the best way to deal with the Cuban leader is the unyielding firmness. Administration officials see little advantage in wavering. So the U.S. government, its standard policy is to take a hard stance against a socialist, wanting upliftment of his people. That's because they're sick Ku Klux Klan racists of the Reagan and Carter administration. It's a Ku Klux Klan racist group of sick whites of Reagan and Carter. Another leftist defamed by U.S. propaganda was Father Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a populist priest who sided with the poor against the rich and who blamed the United States government and its corporate system for much of Haiti's economic woes. In December 1990, shortly before Aristide won an overwhelming 70% of the vote to become Haiti's first freely elected president, the New York Times ran an article, Front-Running Priest, A Shock to Haiti. Okay, so who then in Haiti was shocked by Aristide's candidacy? The business community, the army, the church, the landowners, the kind of people to whom the Times accords respectful attention. The story quotes a downtown businessman who alarmingly describes Aristides as a cross between the Ayatollah and Fidel. Okay, so basically, immediately a black man who's trying to help his people in Haiti, a poor country, is, a cross between Ayatollah and Fidel. That's the way the U.S. government gets away with racism and Ku Klux Klan white supremacy. They are fascist white Ku Klux Klan, sick racists of the U.S. government, and that's the way they get away with it. The United States refused to recognize the junta. Still, it's hard to imagine that the Haitian military, raised and aided by the Pentagon, would have taken such a drastic action if it received a quiet nod from Washington. So what he's saying is basically they overthrew Aristides. Basically, Aristides was taken over through violence. Okay, so, they aided by the Pentagon. Okay, so
once they realized that Washington was not really unhappy by the overthrow. So as soon as the overthrow took place, the U.S. media started saying that Aristides is, a good guy. Let's, put him back in power. But once they realized that Washington was not really unhappy about the overthrow of the leftist priest, who was more loyal to the poor than to the class that Bush and their own media bosses represented, mainstream journalists began to give Aristides the usual mistreatment. A New York Times story referred to him as provocative and legally unquestionable behavior, and a Times News analyst found him to be an insular and menacing leader. Washington Post reported independent observers and diplomats were troubled because Aristides had used explicit and implicit threats of mob violence to intimidate opponents in the wealthy business class in the National Assembly and the Army. So, of course, the U.S. press outright lies. They are mafia journalism, white scoundrels. So, in other words, when the people mobilize as a counterforce to protect a democratic president from an unlawful and violent coup, they should be more thoroughly condemned by that same president because they too committed violent acts in the course of the struggle. Okay, so basically it's okay when they have a counterforce. A New York Times article headlined "High Hand General Says Misdeed Prompted the Coup," gave generous exposure to the coup leader, Brigadier General Raul Cedras, a member of the counterinsurgency set up in the former Duvalier dictatorship and trained by U.S. Special Forces. So Cedras, the military general, overthrew Aristides and then claimed human rights abuse was what prompted it. It is ironic to hear such a charge from the general who has repeatedly committed brutal violations against Duvalier and had just overthrown a popularly elected president, executing many of his democratic supporters. The U.S. media gave more critical attention to Aristides' rhetorical denunciations of the military atrocities than to the atrocities themselves. The media gave almost no attention to Aristides' call for minimum wage, land reform, and enforced tax collection on the affluent, the real reasons for his overthrow. So that's the U.S. government. They want to, get rid of a black man that's trying to help the poor black people of Grenada because they are sick white Ku Klux Klan government racists. That is what their motive in Grenada was, in Haiti was. They're anti-Haitian, sick whites of Washington. So, surveys by non-Haitian groups indicate that human rights violations have fallen sharply during Aristides' tenure in office. Even the branch of the OIS, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, didn't receive even one complaint of human rights violations. Okay, so continuing on. The Ford Foundation and the National Endowment for Democracy, a U.S. government-funded organization that supports leaders who do what Washington wants, basically said that the United States, the Prime Minister of Haiti picked by the army was Jean-Jacques Honorat, a conservative, and he was a recipient of the funds of these organizations. Okay, the message was the same as in so many countries. If democracy picks a leftist leader, then democracy has to go. That's the U.S. government. Get rid of democracy and replace it with fascism, white supremacy. Whites are on top. Everybody is a colonial subject, and you murder them, you disappear them, and you torture them, and that's okay because they're sick Ku Klux Klan murderous whites. But soon after the U.S. invasion, the Washington Post, without supporting information, transmitted the White House view that the economy of Grenada was left bankrupt by its former Marxist rulers. So Washington Post, White House, the economy of Grenada. We talked about Grenada, the New Jewel movement. So it was bankrupt. It bankrupted Grenada. In Libya, worried middle class endurers described a well-educated young woman smartly dressed. When it came to Libya, the way that the government had restricted things, she was not able to take $1,000 to change her wardrobe in Europe in her trip. This is the real hardship. The U.S. is protecting real hardship. The people are starving, and this is what the U.S. government does. They're sick Ku Klux Klan, murderous whites of Washington. The deprivations and oppression faced by the third world masses usually fail to catch the attention of the U.S. media. I cannot say I interviewed many peasants, and nobody else did either, admitted one reporter, referring to his experience in Chile. But he could have been talking about almost any other third world country. So they don't interview people. They just take the military junta's thoughts. That's the way to do it. That's the way to do free press. Take a fascist dictator, mass murders ideas, someone who kidnaps people and murders them secretly, and that's the person to listen to. That's the U.S. press. They're Ku Klux Klan government, white sick racists is what it is. Okay, so when a left government takes office, what wins sympathetic attention of the press is not the distribution of bread and powdered milk, the development of clean drinking water, the literacy campaigns, or the creation of jobs and government-sponsored projects in the impoverished countryside. Rather, it is empty shops in posh neighborhoods. So the drinking water, the good stuff that the leftists do, It's avoided because the shops are empty. The high rich shops, the Victoria's Secrets is empty, but they do have food on the table because they're sick Ku Klux Klan, white racists, sick mentally deranged whites of Washington. So continuing on, okay, so basically, there are several rules that govern media coverage. Nothing positive about democratic reform. No sympathy for the haves and have-nots. Nothing is said about the devastating effects of U.S. policy, proxy wars, invasions, economic embargoes, and sanctions on the economy of the country in question. Assume that economic adversity is exclusively due to mismanagement perpetrated by those who have the audacity to chart a self-determining course. So basically, you're audacious nationalists. Who are you Chinese government? How dare you try to chart an independent course because you're Ku Klux Klan racist, sick whites of Washington, the anti-Chinese sick whites of the U.S. government. It was against this broad shroud of the 1984 democracy in the eyes of the beholder. 1984 Salvadoran presidential election was conducted, guided and financially assisted by the U.S. government. The contest pitted Jose Duarte, a right-wing Christian Democrat, against a longtime apologist for state terrorism, Robert Dawson, head of the Arena Party and long-term practitioner of death squad terrorism. Rather than dismissing the election as a meaningless charade, the New York Times called it a step toward democracy. So you have a death squad terrorist, a Nazi war criminal that's put in power in El Salvador, and then you have him going against Duarte, who's a mass murderer, and that's an election. It's a step toward democracy. That's that white press. It is a mafia. It is a mafia of criminal white journalism. They are white scoundrels, sick racists of the American press. So ABC failed to mention that the invitation contained a suicidal precondition. The guerrillas had to lay down arms in a campaign in the very state they had been being systematically exterminated by the government. Okay, that's what it is. You have weapons, and the government is exterminating you. And if you lay down the weapons, you have, this sort of democratic result. So, background of terror and death squad assassination that made free elections impossible in El Salvador was ignored by the press. So, you have a death squad. If you're a fascist dictatorship, you can't have democratic elections. It's not a democracy. It's a fascist dictatorship. For centuries, imperialists have justified their mistreatment of other peoples by portraying them as wanting in ethical, cultural, and political development. If there be turmoil in some part of the third world, then the trouble supposedly rests with the people themselves and not with anything intruders are doing to them. When the U.S. supported the coup that overthrew Allende and led to the bloody repression of the Pinochet regime, blaming the people became the media's favorite explanation. The CBS commentator Eric Saverit opined that the Chilean people brought it on themselves. Other Latin American example of instability so chronic that the root causes have to lie in the nature and culture of the people. By the way of explaining why Chileans would support Allende and the Popular Unity government, Bernard Collier wrote in the New York Times magazine, the Chileans do not believe in the facts, numbers, or statistics with earnest faith of an English-speaking people. So that's what you do. You just have racism. You just racial purity and white supremacy. You call them low-life Hispanics, and that's why they can't accept Pinochet and they like Allende. That's the way you do it. Would you do that to your whites? Would you do that to your European friends? You wouldn't do that to your European friends because you're Ku Klux Klan white supremacist scoundrels. That is why you torture the Chilean people and the Hispanic people because you're racist, pro-European white scoundrels of the U.S. government, and that's what it is. So, negative and stereotypic representations of Arabs are super abundant. A CBS correspondent ended his report on the Middle East by saying, but of course the sound argument has not dictated Arab behavior. Sound argument is not Arab behavior. New York Times columnist Flora Lewis saw the Islamic mind as unable to employ step-by-step thinking. Had such an assertion applied to the Christian mind or the Hebrew mind, the Times would have likely rejected it as nonsensical and bigoted. So this is the Roman Catholic murderous butchers of the U.S. government. Their racist religious hate against the Muslim people is shown by Flora Lewis's comment. That is what it is. It's racist religious hate by the U.S. Roman Catholic murderous American press and their government is shown by this. So in typical Arab style, Judith Miller of the New York Times claimed that the Gulf Cooperation Council, in typical Arab style, made a veiled reference to the presence of U.S. forces in the Gulf. Miller would never describe an Israeli leader as making a veiled reference in typical Jewish style. Right, so Judith Miller of the New York Times, a Roman Catholic, rapist, torturer, and murderer of the U.S. government, says that they did it, the Gulf Cooperation Council worked in a typical Arab style. So coming down, one of the media's favorite Middle East experts, Fouad Ajami, described Iraq as a brittle lamb with little claim to culture and books and grand ideas. In fact, Iraq was the cradle of an ancient and fertile civilization, and before it was destroyed by American bombs, Baghdad was a major center of literature, art, and architecture. So you get an Arab that agrees with you that Iraq is nothing, it was never anything, and you lie and you promote that Arab. That's the American government. They are Ku Klux Klan, sick, racist whites. This is an important fact, okay? This is an important fact. NPR's Susan Stanberg, interviewing two Arab intellectuals, asked them to comment on an association in her mind, Arabs and death. They patiently explained that, like everyone else, Arabs preferred life over death for themselves and their loved ones. Then she gave another association, Arabs and violence. Stanberg was the citizen of a country in which 25,000 homicides occur each year, along with millions of muggings, rapes, and assaults. A country that spent $300 million yearly on military and supported violent repression throughout much of the Third World, and which in that very moment was waging a murderous war against a vastly smaller and weaker Arab nation. And she was asking why Arabs are so violent. Because they are violent whites. They're violent white racists, fascist, violent whites. That is why they criticize the Arabs for being violent. In a country of 25,000 homicides a year, millions of muggings, rapes and assaults. You're talking about violent Arabs. You're violent Roman Catholic butchers. That is what you are. You're violent Roman Catholic American government thugs. You're Ku Klux Klan mafia thugs is what that response requires. Methods of misrepresentation. We have noted the media's tendency to favor personality over issue, event over content, official positions over popular grievances, and the atypical over the systemic. Supposedly, these biases inhere in the nature of the media themselves, specifically the imperfect practices of reporters, the visual nature of the camera, the limitations of time and budget, and the need to reduce the complex development in a concise story. As we have seen, so many distortions are of a more political nature and reveal a pattern of bias that favors the dominant class interest and status ideology. So selectivity and deliberate omission. So basically, we're talking, as we have seen throughout much of the book, the most common form of media misrepresentation is omission. Many of the omissions involve deliberate decisions. With enough practice and with influence of the dominant political culture, these decisions become almost automatic. Okay, so let's take an example. In 1961, Indonesian army overthrow of President Ahmad Sukarno and embarked upon a murderous campaign to eradicate the Indonesian Communist Party and others, killing 500,000 people, some estimates as high as 1 million, in what was greatest genocidal action since the Nazi Holocaust. Here was a sensationalist story, if ever there was one, but it was 3 months before it appeared as a brief story in the Time magazine, and yet another month before it was reported in the New York Times and treated as a salutary development. The Times editorial actually praised the Indonesian military for rightly playing its part in the utmost caution. The press had little to say about the role of the CIA and the U.S. military in arming and assisting the Indonesian generals, and nothing to say about the economic interest supporting the military coup. Nothing about the abolition of Sukarno's land reform, the destruction of Communist Party libraries, clinics, cooperatives, and schools for the poor, the massive dispossession of the peasants, the widening gap between village rich and poor, the post-coup influx of American, Dutch, and Japanese corporations, the growth of national debt to foreign financiers, and the takeover of Indonesia's miners and foreign firms. So basically, the Ku Klux Klan murders of the United States, they took out Sukarno. Sukarno was, again, a leftist, a socialist who was trying to improve the situation of the peasants, but they took him out, and they put in Indonesian generals, a murderous fascist dictatorship of thugs. And that is what the United States government does. They are racist, Ku Klux Klan, sick whites of Washington. In 1966, the Indonesian military did an encore. It invaded East Timor to eradicate a government headed by Franklin, a popular leftist movement. The Indonesian army took a massive counterinsurgency campaign, bringing death to some 100,000 persons. Here was another remarkable, sensational story the U.S. media treated as non-existent. So East Timor genocide, don't worry about it. The Ku Klux Klan, sick whites of Washington, let it go. In fact, during Sukarno's reign, when Indonesia was taking an openly anti-imperialist stance, it was subjected to abundant negative coverage by the U.S. press. As for Timor, the New York Times Index gave full 6-column citations to that obscure island in 1975 as the Portuguese colonials abandoned the island. The Franklin popular movement was emerging victorious, a situation that concerned the White House and the CIA. So the fascist media hid the criminal action of the Franklin genocide by the Indonesian military and the genocide of the communists, the liberals of Indonesia, and they promoted Indonesia in the coverage when Sukarno was in power and liberalizing, and they promoted Timur in the coverage when the Portuguese were withdrawing. That is the press. They are sick, fascist whites. Lies and face value transmission. Sometimes omissions are not enough, and the press lends itself to dissemination of outright lies. All lies are some degree of omission, but they also contain deliberate embellishment. Not only does it suppress information, they create disinformation, untruths that are repeated again and again in the major media and soon take on a life of their own to be passed with little conscious awareness that a fabrication has been propagated. Gerald Stone, Indonesia, London Times. We've read this before 3 times. Gerald Stone said that there was no destruction in Indonesia. Franklin was behaving appropriately. The Newsweek took the information and lied. Not only did they lie to propagate a party line, but they distorted Stone's own story. They said the Indonesian military was planting lies, is what Stone said. The Newsweek said that Franklin was, atrocious. They were committing atrocious crimes. This is how the U.S. news media promotes a fascist, white sickness. White mental sickness of media journalism. One way to lie is accept the face value what is known to be lies, passing them on to the public without adequate confirmation or countervailing response, without saying a particular story is true or not, but treating it at face value. The press engages in propagation of misinformation while maintaining it as merely non-committal and objective. When challenged on this, some reporters will argue that they cannot inject their own personal judgments into their reports. But no one has asked them to do. In this case, they already do. Our criticism is that the media seldom give us a range of information and views that might allow us to form opinions contrary to official ones that permeate the news. No one is asking for more advocacy journalism. We have enough of that. We need more content and broader context. That is the press. It's Ku Klux Klan fascist press is how we describe it. Why should NBC believe the Russians are Libyans rather than American officials? Okay, they use the ideologic mode of listening to the U.S. government. Readiness to face value transmission as an act of uncritical stenographer for the national security state. The lie comes to the press as automatic becoming a stenographer for the American security establishment. It becomes evident that the media have been lying when, by force of circumstances, they're forced to tell the truth. Okay, so the Iran was portrayed as a great leader. The Shah of Iran was great to the oil companies, but then the Iranian students took hostages. And they said, publish the Shah's atrocities. So finally, they published the Shah's atrocities. He cut off the limbs of a child in front of their parents, and they showed that. And then the American public finally tasted what the Shah was about. The fascist Ku Klux Klan Nazi thugs of the U.S. government. They are murder, sick, racist whites of Washington. Ferdinand Marcos, dictator of the Philippines. Again, they didn't say anything. But ultimately, when he was, exposed as a crazy man, and the Washington took an anti-Filipino stance, an anti-Marcos stance, they said they started to expose his crimes. The press hides them for 20 years, and then they all of a sudden start him out. That's the way the U.S. press is. Continuing on, looking at NPR news programs, one critic concludes that right-wing spokespeople are often interviewed alone. Leftists, on the infrequent occasions they appear. You only have right-wing newscasters. You'll never have left-wing. Regarding media coverage of Africa, basically, newsmen, when they do visit Africa, Black Africa, they're incapable of talking to ordinary people. They talk to the junta. Time and Newsweek on independent struggle on Namibia concentrated concerns of the South African military commanders and officials in Pretoria, Geneva, and Washington, offering no statements from the Namibian revolutionaries or any other independence-minded Namibians. So basically, they just take at face value the South African government, the apartheid, white supremacist, Ku Klux Klan murders, and that is how the U.S. government does it. Lacks balance. They lack balance, the press. Then they make up for it in false balancing. Okay, that's what it is. They don't, try to be truthful. They become false balancing. Killings in El Salvador, extremists of the left and right, they turned it into a, left versus right violence. It was a right dictatorship that was murdering people. That's what it was. Another way to stack the deck in false balancing is employ double standard in interviews.
Ted Koppel, a friend of admired conservative George Will and Henry Kissinger. So you put all three right-wingers together, and then you have an interview, and there's no real discussion, right? That's what leftist, that's what democracy is about. Okay, Dr. Kissinger, his friend. Okay, frame and labeling by bending the truth rather than breaking it. Emphasis, nuance, innuendo, and peripheral embellishments. Communicators can create a desired impression without resorting to explicit advocacy and without departing far from the appearance of objectivity. Just short of lying, the media can mislead us in a variety of ways, telling us what to think about the story before we have heard a chance to think about it for ourselves. For example, CBS Dan Rather, Black civil rights movement and soon anti-war movement as the civil rights disturbances of the 60s, rather than movements for peace and justice and movements against military intervention and racial equality. So that's the racist, sick Dan Rather, the racist, white, sick scoundrel Dan Rather. A report on the Washington Post described the province in El Salvador as guerrilla-infested, calling them lice, right? They're lice, they're guerrilla-infested, rather than guerrilla-controlled areas, equating them with lice. 1984 press coverage of the Lebanon crisis. Press referred to Soviet-made missiles and arms provided by the Syrian Lebanese. But the Israeli missiles being U.S.-made were never described. That's because they are sick racists of the U.S. government, sick Ku Klux Klan whites. Okay, so so Israeli authorities, they jailed journalists, hundreds of journalists. We know it all the time. They always do it. And they were called administrative detention. They were held without charges. But Arabs, when they imprison, Israelis or, terrorists, they're, holding them as hostages. Israeli held 53 UN hostages, and that was okay. They were all Arabs working for the United Nations. The U.S. media never labeled them as hostages. The Southwest Africa People's Organization, struggling to liberate Namibia from white South African occupation, was described as a hardline Marxist movement by the San Francisco Chronicle. The hardline labeling was appeared in a story of SWAPO's opponents, the often murderous Pretoria government that colonized and plundered Namibia for 30 years. For the murderous apartheid regime, the white supremacist friends of the United States, the sick Ku Klux Klan whites of America, supported the murderous apartheid regime's occupation of Namibia. President Allende of Chile, died in the Moneda Palace. He was murdered by the U.S. government. We talked about that. The destruction of trade unions and populist organizations and the many acts of oppression, murder, and torture by the fascist military regime in Turkey. Washington Post described it as controversial measures and as a drive to restrict political dissent. We learned that General Kenan Evren, the despot of Turkey, has a down-to-earth approach and involves himself in the rough and tumble of everyday politics, and that his current crackdown had all but stamped out terrorism. If his democratic opponents were terrorists, then the Evren regime was itself not engaging in terrorism. This is what the whites of Washington do. It's okay if you're Arabs to get murdered, but would they do it to the Europeans? Would they let the Europeans get murdered? Would they let their whites get murdered by a despot? No, because they are hateful white supremacists. They're anti-third world white, hateful whites. They're anti-ethnic, racist, scoundrel, Ku Klux Klan, Nazi government of the United States. Faced with a genocide in East Timor perpetrated by the Indonesian military, complete with widespread burning of crops and intensive aerial bombardment, to starve out and destroy the population, the Washington Post could neutralize as follows. More than 100,000 islanders, 1/6 of the population, died in famine and disease and brought on the hostilities. And the warfare between the Indonesian and Franklin forces further disrupted the fragile agrarian economy and caused heavy casualties. The Indonesian did not starve out and massacre multitudes. The warfare impersonally caused heavy casualties. So they distorted. It's basically distortion. It's called graying of reality. Graying of reality is making things seem different than what they are. It's murder, but it's kind of like, right versus left murder. That's what it is. Okay, Chilean President Shirley Christian was still glossing over the murder of Allende. President Allende died in the course of the coup. The Washington Post reported deep hatreds and killing of civilians that left some 75,000 dead. A use of a passive voice that conveniently avoids telling us who did for the killing. As for South Africa, we were told by the Times that a protest by black squatters led to clashes with the police in which 18 people died. What does led to a clash mean? The police murdered him, but that wasn't discussed. They clashed. Murders, kind of deep hatred and killing of civilians, but 75,000 were dead. We didn't say that. Times noted Mozambique countryside has been devastated
By whom? Was it not the South African-backed mercenary Renamo forces that for years deliberately wreaked death and terror upon the civilian population of Mozambique? According to the Neutralizing Times, the devastation was a result of the conflict that pitted anti-communist Renamo against the Marxist government. On Angola, the Washington Post reported scores of government health centers have been burned down in the countryside, apparently by the rebels. If the word apparently had not been inserted, the report would have sounded less measured, less objective, but would have been more truthful. The rebels were right-wing United forces that received $30 million of aid by covert U.S. assistance. So they were backing a pro-apartheid group of white supremacist, racist thugs. And that is what the Ku Klux Klan Nazi scoundrels of the United States government, they are sick racists of Washington, pretend that they're champions of third world Africans. When the House Select Committee on Narcotics Abuse and Control investigated drug trafficking in Central America, the Washington Post ran this headline: panel finds no evidence linking Contras to drug smuggling. Your headline says one conclusion, while we in fact reached a different one. Charles Rangel said that you lied. Your press, Washington Post, lied. Okay, Washington Post is okay. Lying. You told a falsehood. Contras aren't drug terrorists, but you printed the wrong thing. But they never retracted it. Blatant example. Okay, so cameras lie. Tom Brokaw is a liar. That's what it is. NBC Tom Brokaw, who talked about how the Soviet people suffered the crimes of Stalin. He showed pictures of a Soviet peasant woman weeping over her son's body that had been killed by the Nazis, right? And then he shot of 5 Soviet partisans hanged by the Nazis. Those pictures were used to depict Stalin as a criminal. That's Tom Brokaw. That's the U.S. press. They're sick racists, mentally deranged whites. Okay, so continuing on. A smooth delivery have trained. Newscasters use auxiliary embellishment. They can cultivate a smooth delivery, train voices and restrained demeanors, and try to convey an impression of objective detachment that places them rough and tumble above their subject matter. Okay, so basically, this is smooth delivery. Basically, newscasters' auxiliary embellishments as part of the media. What if it turned out that the CIA's most brutal client state dictators were dealing in drugs? Should that not get prominent play? Certainly if it were someone like General Noriega falling out of flavor from White House favor, but not if it were General Mohammad Zia al-Haq of Pakistan. New York Times, in a minuscule paragraph on an inside page, reported that the drug trade rose sharply after General Zia seized power, and senior figures in the Zia government were said to have ties to drug traffickers. So the poor people of Pakistan, white supremacists, they want them on drugs. They want prostitutes and drug addicts, male prostitutes, male drug addicts, and white women prostitutes. That's the white scoundrels, the sick Ku Klux Klan Nazi American government and their promotion of Zia al-Haq and drug trafficking and prostitution in Pakistan. Likewise, the Amnesty International report that Turkish authorities routinely tortured political prisoners and that 250,000 political detainees in 1980 almost all were tortured. Since Turkey has long been treated by the State Department and the U.S. media as one of the citadels of the free dweller, the New York Times saw torture in Turkey as nothing to get excited about, giving it 2-inch mention in the bottom page of A6. So Turkey, political executions, murder, it's all fine. That's the U.S. government. They're sick racists, and their media are, mafia, state of journalistic thugs. It is often said that lies spread like wildfire while the truth supposedly plods along, never catching up because it is not as sensational nor as timely, hence not as newsworthy. The news has been elevated to some kind of unavoidable law of human communication. But actually, there is no reason for the refutation cannot be given equal exposure and treated with the same urgency and importance as the falsehood. The truth is often much more sensational and revealing than the propaganda lie, as the above examples might indicate. Truth wins a smaller audience not because it is less interesting, because it is treated in a less interesting and less important way. If the truth never catches up with the lie, it is not because of some natural law of communication, but because of the way the truth and lies are communicated. Conscious decision and deliberate effort determine the lie shall be prominently displayed because it serves the dominant interest, and the truth shall be ignored outright, or at best poorly accommodated because it's too damaging to those same interests. So the white scoundrels are liars. It's a mafia government that just lies and peddles its lies, and the press just soaks it up and consciously says, this is what you're going to say. It's an act of fascist white Ku Klux Klan journalism and fascist American dictatorship is how it is. They help create, embellish, give life to the news, array of stereotyped, often misleading, well-executed images, tones, evasions, nuances, suppressions, and fabrications that lend confirmation to the ruling and ideological viewpoint in a process that is not immediately recognized as being the propaganda it is. Their authoritarian voices on radio and television, their decisive wrap-ups, and reassuring appearances for the camera, and their endless columns of sustaining stones and commentaries help us believe that that's the way it is. At the same time, this media message sprouts the public agenda and muffles out genuine public discourse on what the world might really be like and how we might want to change it. So basically, they promote their ideas. It's a fascist government of white thugs, white scoundrels, sick white fascists. And that is how the U.S. mass media soaks up its information. So again, inventing reality, the politics of the news media. Michael Parenti. I'll finish the chapter tomorrow. Very short day tomorrow. Glad you could join us today. Krishna with the I Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.